Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was late autumn, the crisp air brushing against the trees as they shed their last leaves, carpeting the ground in shades of burnt orange and faded yellow. The year was 1987, and small-town life thrived in whispers and tradition. Nestled in a corner of Pennsylvania, Cedar Hollow was a town where everybody knew everybody. Rows of modest homes lined the streets, each with its own history, passed down through generations. This was the kind of place where stories were shared around fire pits, where the past seemed to linger just a little longer in the creaking of floorboards and the murmurs of the wind. I had lived in Cedar Hollow all my life, the quiet streets familiar under the lamplight. My childhood was spent running between the tall oaks that bordered the town, their branches stretching out like old friends welcoming me back. But tonight's story isn't about the rustling of leaves or the charm of an old community. It's about what lies beyond the warmth of familiarity. It's about the shadows that cling to forgotten places and the secrets carried by seemingly innocent things. The story begins with the Donovan family, whose name was synonymous with Cedar Hollow's only bridal boutique. The shop had been around for decades, tucked between a quaint bookstore and a bakery whose scent of freshly baked bread drew people in from blocks away. The boutique, Donovan's Elegance, was passed down through generations, known for crafting memories for countless brides-to-be. But there was one gown in particular, a relic from a time long past, that would change everything. It was stored in a special corner of the boutique, encased in a glass display. The dress was simple, lace hugging its neckline, and a subtle train that spoke of understated elegance. No one in town knew why it was there or who it once belonged to, but there were whispers, older than my parents, older than even my grandparents. They said the gown had seen more than just joyous unions and loving gazes. The boutique owner, Eleanor Donovan, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s, claimed it was there to honor family history, but she avoided elaborating further. When asked, she would only shake her head, her thin lips pressing into a line that told you not to pry. As a child, I remember pressing my nose against the shop's cool glass, looking at that dress under the flickering light. It seemed different from the others, the air around it feeling heavy, as if the space was holding its breath. But those were just childhood thoughts, right? A trick of a young mind convinced that the world was a little more mysterious than it seemed. Fast forward a few years, I had just started working at Donovan's Elegance as a part-time assistant. It was Eleanor who had offered me the job after she spotted me helping a lost customer on the street. I didn't know then how deep I would be pulled into the story that surrounded the dress. The boutique, with its soft, yellow lighting and rows of pristine white gowns, was a place where dreams were nurtured. Brides would enter wide-eyed, fingers brushing fabric as they whispered about their futures. It was a space filled with hopeful chatter, the scent of fresh roses Eleanor kept in a vase by the counter, and the soft melody of classical music drifting from an old radio. For a while, everything was as one would expect. I'd tidy up the displays, steam dresses, and watch as brides and their families fawned over tulle and satin. But as I spent more time there, I began noticing small, almost imperceptible things. The air near the glass-encased dress was always a touch colder, even on warm days. A shiver would skitter down my spine if I lingered too close. The radio would sometimes stutter into silence when I walked by that particular corner, only to pick up its tune moments later. I brushed off these oddities as coincidences, telling myself that the stories were just that, stories. After all, who believed in curses or restless spirits? Cedar Hollow was full of tales, and they were meant to amuse, to entertain, not to be taken seriously. That's what I thought, until the evening everything began to change. The Donovan family had always been a fixture of Cedar Hollow. Generations of Donovans had called the small town home, and each had left a unique imprint on the community. The most visible of the family's legacy was, of course, Donovan's Elegance, the bridal boutique at the heart of Cedar Hollow's main street. But the Donovans were more than just business owners. They were woven into the fabric of the town's history, each member contributing in their own way to the town's ever-changing story. Eleanor Donovan, now in her late 60s, was the matriarch of the family. Her presence was one of quiet authority, her gray eyes sharp and calculating despite her soft features. Eleanor had inherited the shop from her mother, who had taken it over from her grandmother. She had never married, never had children of her own, and in many ways, the boutique was her child. Her life revolved around the small space where she spent her days arranging dresses, fitting brides, and overseeing every detail of the boutique's operation. She was well-liked, though not particularly open with others. Her small talk was warm, but her gaze often lingered just a little too long, as if she were holding back a secret. Eleanor's niece, Clara, was a few years younger than me, and it was through her that I found my way into Donovan's elegance. Clara was a bright, bubbly woman in her early 30s, with an easy smile and an infectious laugh that filled the boutique when she was around. She had been working at the shop for years, handling the social media accounts and helping brides select their perfect dresses. It was Clara who encouraged me to apply for the job when she saw me browsing the store one afternoon. She seemed to be a natural fit for the job, eager to help others find happiness in the simplest of moments, finding the right wedding dress. Though she had no children of her own, she had a warmth about her that made you feel comfortable, as if you were a part of something more than just a transaction. She was quick to offer her opinions, never afraid to tell you if a dress wasn't quite right, but it was always done with care and kindness. Then there was me, the newest member of the team. I had just graduated from high school a few months earlier and had been unsure about what to do next. I wasn't quite ready for college yet, and the idea of a job at Donovan's Elegance seemed like a good way to fill the gap. I had always liked the idea of helping others, and there was something strangely comforting about the idea of working in a place that celebrated love and joy. I was a bit shy at first, a quiet observer, but I quickly learned the ropes of the boutique. I would dust the shelves, iron the gowns, and help with the most mundane tasks, yet there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing I was part of something so timeless, something that mattered to so many people. My first few weeks at the boutique were exactly what I had hoped for: quiet, peaceful, and filled with the soft clink of hangers and the rustling of fabric. It was the sort of place where you could get lost in the mundane tasks and feel a sense of accomplishment. Every day, I'd arrive just after the bakery across the street opened, its smell of warm bread wafting through the air. Eleanor was usually already at the boutique by the time I arrived, getting the shop ready for the day's appointments. Clara would join us later, helping clients choose gowns or handling phone calls, always with a smile. The town itself was a reflection of the simplicity and charm of Cedar Hollow. It wasn't large or bustling like the cities you might find an hour or so away, but it had its own rhythm. People would stop and chat as they walked down the sidewalk, and the same faces passed by every day, most of them the same faces you'd see at the grocery store, or in church on Sundays, or at the diner on a lazy afternoon. Cedar Hollow was a place where everyone knew everyone else, where you didn't need to lock your doors because you trusted your neighbors. It was a safe place to grow up, where things moved slowly, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. In the mornings, the shop was calm. The faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional ringing of the doorbell when a customer entered were the only sounds to break the silence. It was often Clara and me who would greet customers, taking them through the racks of dresses and offering suggestions based on what they told us. Eleanor rarely interacted with the customers unless she had to. She was content to watch from a distance, occasionally offering a word of advice or a critical comment. It was clear to me that she didn't fully trust Clara and me to handle things on our own, but we made do. It was a steady, predictable rhythm. The boutique was filled with dresses of every style. Some were modern, with sleek lines and minimalist designs, while others were more classic, adorned with lace, satin, and pearls. There was something calming about the variety of gowns, the way they hung from their racks like old friends waiting to be worn. But the most intriguing thing in the store was the wedding dress in the glass case in the corner. It had always been there, at least as long as I could remember. The gown was an antique, its lace yellowing with age, the fabric fragile and delicate. No one ever spoke about it much, though it was hard to miss when you entered the boutique. I'd always been curious about it, but there was something about that dress, something unsettling that made it hard to ask about. Eleanor rarely spoke of it, and when Clara did, it was always in passing, as if it was just another part of the store's decor. But there was an odd energy that seemed to cling to it, something I couldn't quite place. As the days went by, I grew more accustomed to the routine of the shop, and the oddities of the place began to feel normal. The shop's quiet rhythm continued without much interruption, save for the occasional bride-to-be who walked in with stars in her eyes, searching for the perfect gown. Most customers were pleasant, if a little stressed, as weddings tend to bring out the most nerve-wracking details in people. But it was a simple life, one I had never thought twice about. At least, not until that day. Life in Cedar Hollow was simple, predictable, and peaceful, but there was something about the dress, the one that had been in the shop for as long as anyone could remember, that started to feel wrong. But at the time, I didn't understand why. It was a calm autumn morning, like any other. I had arrived early for my shift, just as the first few rays of sun filtered through the shop's windows. The light cast long shadows across the polished floors, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery across the street drifted through the air. But as I stood there, arranging a few dresses on the racks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. And that was the first time I noticed it, the coldness near the display case. It started on a crisp Thursday morning. The shop was quiet as usual, with the steady rhythm of daily life keeping everything in place. Eleanor had already begun her rounds, checking each gown to ensure it was in perfect condition. Clara, as usual, had arrived just after me, her cheerful hum echoing through the shop as she flipped through a bridal magazine. It was the kind of morning where nothing seemed out of place a normal day. But as the sun started to climb higher in the sky, something began to feel different. It wasn't obvious at first, but I felt it in my bones, as if the air in the shop had shifted just slightly. A chill seemed to settle in the corners, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though the shop was completely empty. It started with the dress, the one in the display case. I had always avoided it before, but on that particular morning, I noticed something odd. The fabric of the gown, which had always been slightly yellowed with age, appeared new. Not brand new, but fresher than it had ever looked. The lace was no longer dull and faded, but almost pristine, as though it had been carefully cleaned. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. There was no way that dress could have changed overnight. Eleanor had never mentioned getting it cleaned or restored, and no one else had touched it. "Clara, look at this," I called out, my voice betraying a sense of unease I couldn't quite explain. Clara looked up from the magazine, her expression light and casual. "What is it?" she asked, stepping over to where I stood. I pointed at the dress. "Doesn't that look different to you?" Clara squinted, her brow furrowing as she examined the gown closely. "Huh, that's strange. It doesn't look like that yesterday, does it?" I shook my head. "No, it's almost like it's been cleaned." Clara took another step forward, her eyes narrowing as she reached out to touch the display case. "Weird," she muttered. "Maybe Eleanor had someone come in to restore it. She's always been protective of that dress." "But she never mentioned it," I said, my voice quiet. "And it still doesn't explain why it looks different." Clara shrugged it off. "Maybe it's just the light. You know, sunlight changes how fabric looks." But even as Clara dismissed the oddity, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the dress, it was everything about the shop that day. The air felt too still, the silence too heavy. Even the normal sound of the bell ringing when a customer entered felt muted. I tried to get back to work, arranging the dresses on the racks and focusing on the mundane tasks of the morning. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. The dress in the corner called to me in a way I couldn't explain. Every time I passed by it, my gaze was drawn to it, and each time I felt the odd sensation that something wasn't right. The first real sign that something was off came during lunch. Clara and I were sitting in the small break room in the back of the shop, eating sandwiches and chatting about the upcoming wedding season. Eleanor was off running errands, leaving the two of us alone in the shop. It was a peaceful moment, and I was starting to relax, the tension of the morning slowly melting away. That's when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it was a customer coming in, but then I glanced at the door. It remained closed. The bell had rung, but the door hadn't moved. A chill ran down my spine, and I looked at Clara, who had gone suddenly still. "That's weird," she said, her voice tight. "The bell shouldn't ring unless the door opens." I felt my heart race, but I tried to remain calm. It was probably just a malfunction, a glitch in the system. The doorbell had been known to go off from time to time for no reason. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. Clara stood up, walking toward the door, and I followed her. "See, there's nothing here," she said, peering out into the empty street. I nodded, still unsettled. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, trying to make sense of it. "Sometimes the pressure can trigger things." Clara shrugged. "Maybe." But neither of us felt reassured. We went back to our sandwiches, but the conversation had shifted. There was a quiet tension in the air, an unspoken awareness that something was wrong, even if we couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The next day, things took a more bizarre turn. I arrived at the shop early again, my footsteps echoing in the empty space as I unlocked the door. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed that the air was cooler than usual, almost damp. It wasn't exactly cold, but it felt like something was amiss. I shivered involuntarily, trying to shrug off the sensation. I was setting up for the day when I noticed the doorbell again. This time, it rang 3 times in quick succession, but no one was there. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around, scanning the shop for any sign of movement. But it was empty, just like before. I looked at the clock, 8:03 a.m. There was no wind, no traffic outside, just the bell ringing out in the stillness. My pulse quickened, and for the first time since I started working at Donovan's Elegance, I felt the weight of something heavy hanging in the air. I stood still, trying to rationalize it. I could hear Clara's footsteps approaching from the back room, and I was relieved to see her. "Clara," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Clara asked, stepping into the shop. "The bell. It rang again." Clara looked confused. "It's probably nothing, right?" I shook my head. "No, it rang 3 times, by itself. There was no one here." She seemed to hesitate for a moment. "That's odd, but it could just be a malfunction. This old bell has been acting weird for a while." But the way she said it didn't reassure me. I could tell she was trying to convince herself as much as me that it was just a glitch. I glanced over at the corner where the dress stood, still gleaming with its restored appearance. Something about it called to me again, more strongly than before. It was as if the dress had drawn me in, compelling me to look at it, to notice it, in a way I hadn't before. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. There was something in the way it seemed almost alive, the way the lace caught the light in a way that didn't feel quite natural. Clara seemed to notice my staring and let out a small, nervous laugh. "You're acting like it's got a life of its own," she said, trying to make light of it. "Maybe it's the early morning or something." But I wasn't convinced. The dress, the doorbell, the strange chill in the air, they were all adding up to something I couldn't explain. Something that felt far too real to ignore. As the days stretched into the following weeks, the incidents became more frequent, and the air in Donovan's Elegance grew thicker with an unsettling presence. I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was wrong. At first, I chalked up each strange occurrence to coincidence or my imagination until I couldn't ignore them any longer. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling a coldness in the air that no one else seemed to notice. It started with the doorbell. It would ring without explanation, sometimes just once, other times in a rapid, frantic succession. I would look toward the door, expecting a customer to walk in, but no one ever did. At first, I assumed it was a glitch, something electrical that could easily be fixed. But after the 3rd or 4th time it happened without anyone present, I began to doubt that explanation. I froze in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. Clara was arranging a row of dresses near the back of the shop, unaware of what I had seen. Slowly, I stepped closer to the display case, my breath shallow. It was almost imperceptible, the slightest shift in the lace, a movement so faint that I questioned whether I had imagined it. But the more I stared at it, the more certain I became that something was wrong. "Clara," I whispered, voice trembling. "Did you see that?" Clara glanced up, her face scrunched in confusion. "See what?" she asked, walking toward me. "That dress." I trailed off, not sure how to explain it. "It moved." She followed my gaze to the gown, standing in front of the display case, and raised an eyebrow. "You're seeing things. There's nothing there." But I wasn't convinced. I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the dress was somehow alive, as though it were calling to me, pulling me in. The doorbell rang again, cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. This time, I couldn't dismiss it as a malfunction. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. And it always seemed to happen when the dress caught my attention, when the air around it grew heavier. Clara had noticed it too. One evening, after closing time, she stayed behind to help me clean up. The shop was quiet, save for the sound of our footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floors. Suddenly, Clara stopped mid-step, her hand hovering over a rack of dresses. She looked toward the back of the shop, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked, following her gaze. "I swear I saw something move," she said, her voice low and shaky. I couldn't help but feel a rush of panic in my chest. "What do you mean?" "Like, the dress?" Clara nodded, slowly backing away from the display case. "It was just there, in the corner of my eye, but I don't know. It was almost like the dress shifted, just for a second." I didn't need to hear more to know what she meant. We had both seen it, the way the gown almost seemed to change form, as though something in the fabric was shifting beneath the surface. But there was something else, something I couldn't ignore. I began to notice faint, almost imperceptible sounds in the shop. They weren't loud enough to be considered noises, but they were there, scratching, like something moving against the fabric, or the faintest rustling, like lace brushing against the floor. The air itself felt heavier at times, as though it was thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I decided it was time to investigate, to get to the bottom of what was happening. But where could I even start? I couldn't explain what I was feeling, let alone the strange phenomena happening around us. But I had to try. The first thing I did was look into the history of the dress itself. Eleanor had mentioned once, in passing, that the gown had been in her family for generations, but she had never gone into detail about its origins. I decided to ask her about it directly, hoping she could shed some light on the situation. The next day, I caught Eleanor after she'd finished dealing with a client. I could tell she was tired, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was a sharpness to her gaze when I mentioned the dress. "Eleanor, I have to ask you something," I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "What do you know about that gown? Where did it come from?" Her expression shifted, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied me for a moment, as though weighing her words carefully. "That dress," she began slowly, "has been in my family for generations. It's not just any gown, you know. It's been passed down from mother to daughter, from one bride to the next. But there are stories." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of stories?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Eleanor hesitated again, her eyes flickering toward the dress in the corner. "They say it's cursed, that every bride who wears it suffers some sort of tragedy. I don't know if I believe in those things, but strange things have happened with that gown. People have said it has a will of its own." A shiver ran through me as I took in her words. My instincts were screaming at me now, urging me to walk away, to forget the dress and its history. But it was too late. The pieces were falling into place, and I knew I couldn't turn back now. I tried to shake off the heaviness in the air, but it followed me everywhere. The shop, once a place of quiet calm, now felt like a trap. I couldn't help but feel that something dark was lurking, just waiting for the right moment to strike. As the days wore on, the strange occurrences continued to escalate. The dress seemed to shift more frequently, almost as if it were responding to the tension in the shop. And the doorbell, once a subtle annoyance, now rang with alarming frequency, its chimes echoing through the shop like a warning. One evening, as Clara and I were closing up for the night, the bell rang again, this time louder than ever. We both turned toward the door, but there was no one there. The air felt thick, as though the shop itself was holding its breath. "Clara, I don't think we should be here," I said, my voice trembling. But Clara was already walking toward the dress, her eyes fixed on it with a strange intensity. "We need to understand what's happening," she said quietly, her tone almost hypnotic. I tried to stop her, but it was as if she couldn't hear me. The tension in the room was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, the force of it rattling the windows. We both turned toward it, our hearts racing. But when I looked back at the dress, I froze. It wasn't just shifting anymore, it was moving, the lace rippling as if a gust of wind had caught it, though the air in the shop was still. Something in that moment snapped. I grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We need to get out of here now," I urged, panic rising in my chest. But as we reached for the door, the bell rang again, this time in a sharp, discordant tone, as though warning us. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The dress. It was no longer in the display case. It had moved. Our eyes locked, terror gripping us both as we realized we were not alone in the shop. The tension in the air exploded in a rush of cold. Something was in that room with us, and we weren't getting out easily. I had seen it move, I was certain of it. The gown, once standing pristinely in the corner, was now gone. There was no sign of it in its usual spot, no fabric or lace peeking from behind the other dresses. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it after all. We were both under such strain from the strange happenings in the store. But then I saw it. In the corner of the shop, near the old wooden mirror, the fabric of the gown shimmered faintly in the dim light, its lace shimmering like the outline of a ghostly figure. But the gown wasn't hanging, wasn't draped over the stand, it was moving. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. It's alive," she whispered hoarsely. But there was no time to process it. Before either of us could react, the temperature in the shop dropped drastically, as if the very air had become heavier, thick with an unnatural cold. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up, the chill creeping into my bones, making every step feel more labored. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she asked, barely above a whisper. I nodded, though the words were lodged in my throat, unable to make their way out. Something was here. Something that wasn't human, and it wasn't trying to hide. The gown, still floating in the corner, suspended in the air, began to twitch, the fabric shifting as if caught in an unseen breeze. The lace rippled in a delicate yet frantic movement, as though the dress itself was trying to break free of whatever force held it. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt the weight of its presence, as if the gown wasn't just an object anymore, but a manifestation of something much darker. A sound low and guttural echoed again, more pronounced this time, like a hiss that rose from the depths of the shop. My heart thundered in my chest, my pulse quickening as the air seemed to tighten around us, thick and suffocating. "Get out," a voice rasped. I couldn't believe it. The voice had been low, almost too faint to catch, but it was unmistakable. It came from the direction of the gown, though there was no figure standing there, just the eerie, shimmering lace hanging impossibly in the air. Clara and I froze, both of us locked in place, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before us. "Did you hear that?" I managed to say, my voice barely more than a shaky whisper. Clara's face had drained of color, her hands trembling at her sides. "Yes," she breathed. "We need to leave. Now." But the door, once our way of escape, was still closed, its frame stubbornly locked, as if sealed by some invisible force. It was no longer an option. We were trapped. The gown moved again, its lace twisting as if caught in a sudden gust of wind. The soft whispering noise grew louder, more distinct. My pulse raced as I could hear the distinct hiss again, the voice clearer this time. "Leave this place now." My breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't an electrical malfunction or my overactive imagination. There was something in the shop, something connected to that dress. A dark presence that was determined to make its existence known. Clara took a step back, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's the dress," she whispered. "It is cursed. We were warned. We were warned." I didn't know how to respond, how to process what was happening in front of me. The shop, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around us. The dress, hovering near the mirror, began to move in strange, erratic patterns, its lace twisting into shapes that didn't make sense, as though it was trying to communicate something. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the room, and the sound of something breaking sent us both jumping in alarm. I turned just in time to see one of the display mirrors shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces, the glass scattering across the floor in an explosion of sharp edges. The air thickened further, the cold intensifying, as if the entire shop had been swallowed by a force far beyond our understanding. Then the voice, louder now, distorted, rose again, speaking with an authority that shook me to my core. "You should have never come here," it growled, the words heavy with malevolent power. "This place is mine." I could feel the cold wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was an entire force, a dark energy that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the shop. The dress hung in the air, glowing faintly now, its lace shimmering unnaturally, pulsing with each new breath. "We need to go," Clara gasped, her face twisted in a mix of fear and disbelief. But before we could move, the room seemed to warp, the walls bending and shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The shop, which had once felt familiar, had become unrecognizable, twisting, darkening, as if something was warping the very fabric of reality itself. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dress. It was no longer just a piece of clothing. It had become something else, something far darker. The lace undulated, expanding and contracting, a strange energy rippling outward. It felt alive, as if it were breathing, as if it had a presence all its own. Suddenly, the room spun around us, a blur of shadows and movement. A dark figure, flickering in and out of existence, appeared before the gown, its form indistinct and shrouded in an eerie, pulsating glow. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely, but the presence was unmistakable, the terror it exuded real and terrifying. The figure stepped toward us, and I felt a wave of pure dread wash over me. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in from every side. It was then I realized that it wasn't just the dress that had power, it was the place itself, the shop, the mirror, everything that had been tied to it. The figure stopped in front of us, its face obscured, and the voice returned, a distorted, hollow echo that sent chills running down my spine. "You should not have disturbed me," it said, its voice both thunderous and intimate, vibrating in my very soul. "Now you will remain." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me, the horror of the moment too overwhelming to fully process. All I knew was that the figure, the dress, and the shop itself were no longer just part of my reality. They had become something else, something beyond explanation. And as I stood there, trapped in the heart of the shop with Clara beside me, I realized we were no longer in control. This place was far beyond our understanding, and whatever it was not willing to let us go. In that moment, all the questions I had ever had, all the mysteries surrounding the shop and the dress, seemed irrelevant. We were caught in something much larger than us, something ancient, something deadly. And there was no escape. As the figure before us slowly faded back into the shadows, I could feel the oppressive weight of the air lifting ever so slightly. It was as if a massive pressure had been released, just enough to allow me to take a full breath. But even in that brief moment of relief, the fear still gripped me like fingers tightening around my chest, making it hard to think clearly, to process the events unfolding before me. Clara, pale and trembling, clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin, as though holding on to me was the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice shaky. But I could see in her eyes the same question that burned in my mind. Could we really leave? Was it even possible? The shop was still a strange place, far from the cozy, familiar spot I had once known. The mirror, shattered moments earlier, had already begun to reassemble itself, the jagged edges of glass slowly shifting and mending as if no harm had ever been done. The air was still cold, though the sinister presence seemed to have pulled back for the moment, lingering just out of reach, like an unseen predator waiting for its moment to strike. "I don't think we can," I murmured, my voice distant as I surveyed the room around us. Clara turned to face me, her eyes wide with fear, yet a hint of determination flickered beneath the surface. "What do you mean?" "We have to leave. We have to find a way out." But as her words hung in the air, I felt an overwhelming pull toward the back of the shop, toward the hidden corner where the gown had first begun its strange dance. Something was drawing me there, a force too strong to ignore. As if my body were no longer my own, I stepped forward, my legs moving with a will of their own, carrying me toward the place that had caused everything to spiral out of control. Clara called my name, her voice sharp and frantic, but it was as though her words were muffled by some invisible barrier. I couldn't stop myself. The need to understand what had happened, to confront whatever had taken control of this place, was too overwhelming to ignore. As I reached the spot where the dress had once hung, I felt an eerie stillness. The gown was gone, but the mirror before me was reflecting something strange, distorted images, as though the glass had been warped by some unseen force. I peered into the reflection, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw it her. The woman who had been trapped in the dress. Her ghostly figure, barely visible, standing behind the mirror with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. But before I could take another step, a loud bang echoed from the door, snapping me out of my trance. Clara's voice, frantic now, broke through the thick tension of the room. "Please, please, let's go." I blinked, and the figure in the mirror was gone. The room around me felt quieter, less charged with the strange energy that had enveloped us only moments before. I turned back to Clara, my mind racing to piece together what had just happened. The woman in the mirror, the dress, the presence in the shop, it was all connected. But how? And what had that figure meant when it said, "Now, you will remain"? Clara was already halfway to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. "Let's go. Let's leave," she pleaded, her voice shaking. And though every part of me wanted to stay and understand more, wanted to confront whatever force had taken control of the shop, something inside me knew she was right. We couldn't fight this. We didn't have the power to understand what was happening. I walked toward the door, the echo of my footsteps strangely muffled by the unnatural silence of the shop. When I reached Clara, I placed my hand on the cold metal handle, and for a moment I thought I heard the faintest sound, a low, dissonant hum coming from the far corner of the room. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. With a final glance at the mirror, I pushed the door open, and the crisp night air washed over me, sending a shiver down my spine. The darkness outside felt like a relief, as if the weight of the shop's strange grip had finally loosened. We didn't say a word as we stepped out into the quiet street, the door closing behind us with an unsettling finality. We didn't look back, but I could feel the weight of the place lingering in my thoughts. The terror we had experienced, the chilling sense that something had been watching, waiting, and had followed us into the night. In the days that followed, Clara and I tried to move on. We both stayed away from the shop, though it lingered in our minds, a shadow we couldn't quite shake off. I found myself glancing nervously over my shoulder whenever I walked past it, my thoughts always returning to the strange events that had unfolded within its walls. But no matter how much I tried to forget, the questions remained. Who had the woman been? What had happened to the dress? And why did it seem to have such a hold on everything around it? And most haunting of all, was it truly over? Had we escaped, or was the shop simply biding its time, waiting for the next moment to reveal itself? I didn't know. What I did know was that the mystery of the shop would never be fully understood. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange occurrences that didn't fit together. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all, that some mysteries were simply never meant to be solved. As I sat quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle into my chest. The shop was still there, standing in the same quiet, unassuming place. But I knew, deep down, that it was never truly empty. There was something still in that space, waiting, watching. And perhaps, one day, someone else would step inside, unknowingly walking into the same mystery, the same terror that we had. But for now, all I could do was move on. At least, that's what I told myself. The questions, the fear, the confusion, they would remain unanswered. And yet, the strange feeling of being watched, of being tied to that place, would never truly leave. I would carry it with me forever, a lingering sense of mystery that no amount of distance could ever erase. And so, as I turned away from the memories of that night, I couldn't help but wonder, was it really over? Or was it just waiting, quietly, for the next soul to come along and disturb the peace of the shop once more? The answer remained unclear, and perhaps it always would. But one thing was certain. Whatever it was far from finished. As I sit here reflecting on everything that has transpired, I can't help but feel a strange mixture of emotions. There's a sense of closure, of course, in knowing that Clara and I have left that haunting shop behind. We're no longer bound to the cold walls or the ominous energy that seemed to pulse with life. But there's also something else, something unsettling that lingers just beneath the surface. We walked away, physically removed from the place. We moved on with our lives, or at least tried to. But in the quiet moments, when I allow myself to think, I wonder if we ever truly escaped. The memories are still there. That oppressive weight in the air, the chilling sense that someone or something was always watching. Even now, I can hear the faint echo of the voice that warned us. Now, you will remain. I don't know what it meant, but I can't shake the feeling that those words were more than just a threat. They were a promise that whatever force had been at play in that shop wasn't done with us. Not yet. It's funny how something that seems so far behind can still echo in your mind, isn't it? The brain has a way of holding on to things, especially the things that scare us. The things we can't quite explain. It's like that shop, that gown, and the strange woman who seemed to come alive in the reflection were all just fragments of something bigger, something we weren't meant to understand. Maybe that's the scariest part of it, all the unknown. The uncertainty. We'll never know what that shop really was, or why it acted the way it did. Maybe it was a place haunted by something as simple as the history of its items, forgotten things that took on a life of their own. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something far darker, something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. And then there's the question of the dress. It wasn't just an object, was it? No, it was far more than that. It was the center of it all. It was the source of the unease, the fear, the strange happenings. But where did it come from? And why did it act so aggressively toward anyone who came near it? I don't have the answers, and I doubt anyone else ever will. What I do know is that there's a reason places like that shop exist, whether they're physical or mental spaces. They remind us that there's always something lurking just out of view, something we might never truly comprehend. And sometimes we're better off not knowing. As much as I'd like to think that Clara and I got out unscathed, I know deep down that we'll never be free of that place. No one who has experienced something like we did truly walks away unmarked. The fear may fade, the details may blur, but the feeling of being watched, of being a part of something bigger than ourselves, sticks with you. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that some experiences are like scars, they never really heal. You can move on, live your life, and try to forget, but the memories are always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. So, as I bring this story to a close, I leave you with this. There are mysteries in this world that we may never understand. Places that seem ordinary on the outside, but hide things that cannot be explained. This one is a little different, more unsettling, more real. It's a story about an experience that happened to me, and it's not just any story. It's a true one that I still can't fully explain. A story about the night shift, about being alone in an office building that seemed to take on a life of its own. So, if you're ready, let me take you back. It was a few years ago, back when I was still working at a small marketing firm in the middle of the city. We were in a new office building, a sleek structure with polished glass windows, a modern lobby, and rows of cubicles stretching as far as the eye could see. The firm had recently moved into the building, and everything felt fresh: new carpets, new furniture, new energy. But like most office buildings, there were always parts of it that felt off, uninviting. You know the feeling, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the ceiling, the quiet echo of your footsteps bouncing off the empty halls late at night. The only thing you could hear was the occasional beep of the elevator or the sound of someone on the other end of a late-night phone call. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stretch, where the walls seemed to quietly absorb every footstep and every conversation, and where you could almost forget that the whole building wasn't empty. I had always been the kind of person who worked late. It wasn't that I had to, it's just that I enjoyed the peace and quiet that came with being the last one left. The work would get done faster, and the silence allowed me to focus in a way I couldn't when the office was bustling with activity. Plus, it was always nice to have the building to yourself. On that particular night, I was working the graveyard shift. It was around 11 p.m. when everyone had gone home. The office was dim, the only light coming from the glow of my computer screen. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. My coworkers had all headed out hours ago, leaving only me to finish up the last few tasks. It wasn't an unusual shift for me. In fact, I had gotten used to the late-night atmosphere of the building. But on this particular night, something felt different. Something felt off. I remember sitting there, eyes scanning the screen as I typed away, but my mind kept drifting back to the eerie silence of the office. It was as if the building itself was watching me. There was something unnerving about how quiet it was. No creaking floors, no random sounds of a door closing, no elevator dings, just complete, almost suffocating silence. It was the kind of silence that made you start to listen too closely to every small sound around you, made you question the nature of every creak and groan the building made. I was just finishing up some data entry when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a soft clicking sound. I looked up from my computer, expecting to see something out of the ordinary. But there was nothing. I figured it was just a stray sound from the building settling or the air conditioning turning on. It didn't worry me at first. The building was old after all, and buildings make noises, especially at night when everything's still. But then the clicking came again, and this time it was a little louder. It sounded almost like footsteps, but there was no one else in the office. I glanced at the clock on my desk. It was well past midnight now, and I hadn't seen anyone else leave the building, not since the last elevator ride I had heard. I sat there, frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Buildings make all sorts of sounds, piping, settling, the wind outside pushing against the windows. I tried to shake it off, but then I heard it again. This time, it was definitely footsteps. But they were soft, slow, as if someone was walking toward my desk. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The office was still empty, but the sound was undeniable. The footsteps were coming closer, right outside my cubicle. I peered out into the hallway, but there was no one there. No footsteps on the carpet, no shadow passing by. I felt a chill creep up my spine. For a few minutes, I just stood there, listening, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. The footsteps continued, now moving around the corner, down the hallway, and closer toward the break room. I should have gone to check. I should have walked out there and seen if anyone had stayed behind, maybe a janitor or a late-night employee who had gotten caught up in their work. But something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about the sound. It didn't feel like the footsteps of a person. It didn't feel like anyone walking at all. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears as I slowly backed away from my desk. I sat back down in my chair, my fingers trembling on the edge of the keyboard. My mind raced. Was it the building settling? Was it a prank by one of the night security guards? I tried to focus on my work, but every now and then, the sound would come again. The clicking, the steps always just out of sight, always close, but never visible. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if something was truly wrong, but that night, the office felt different. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It felt as if something in the building was alive, aware, and waiting. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. And that's how the night started, how it all began. Little did I know then that this seemingly mundane night shift would turn into something I'd never be able to forget. But this was just the beginning. The first hint that something wasn't quite right in that building, in that office. Something was watching, listening, waiting for the right moment. The office building where all of this took place wasn't anything out of the ordinary. On the surface, it was just another corporate building in a busy city, an area filled with companies, startups, and offices lining every street. The kind of place where people rushed to work during the day and left after hours, sometimes barely acknowledging each other as they passed. The atmosphere was quiet, yet unremarkable, exactly what you'd expect from a place that relied on routine and structure. The company I worked for at the time, a small marketing firm, had moved into this building a few months before. The firm had started small, but after landing a few big clients, we'd grown rapidly. With that success, we'd upgraded our office space. We moved from a cozy but cramped little unit across town to a more spacious one in this sleek new building. Our new office was on the 5th floor, with a floor-to-ceiling view of the street below. The windows let in plenty of natural light during the day, but once the sun set, the office turned dark and quiet, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. I remember how clean everything looked when we first moved in: new desks, fresh paint, polished floors. The place had that sterile, almost empty feel you get when a building is brand new, with no personal touches yet. The walls were bare except for a few generic office art pieces, and the break room had nothing but vending machines stocked with snacks. It wasn't an exciting space, but it was functional. The kind of place you'd go to work, get things done, and head home. But there was one thing that stood out about the building, a detail that should have been insignificant, but became increasingly important to me: the building's layout. It wasn't your typical office layout where all the floors were open and interconnected. This building was built with long, narrow hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. Each floor had a central elevator lobby, and the hallways extended from there, leading to various office spaces, conference rooms, and smaller meeting rooms. Every floor felt more isolated than it needed to be. At night, especially when the building was empty, the long, echoing hallways seemed to make the place feel larger and emptier than it actually was. The lighting in the hallways wasn't much better. The overhead lights were dimmer than they should have been, giving the whole place a faint, yellowish glow. It wasn't quite bright enough to feel fully comfortable, but it was enough to keep you from feeling completely blind in the dark. You could tell that someone had made an effort to make the building feel modern, but there was always something off about it, something that made it feel distant. Then there were the people. The first person I should introduce is my boss, Greg. Greg was the kind of guy who always wore a tie, even when we weren't meeting clients. He was a mid-40s guy, always neat and put together, with a stern yet friendly demeanor. He had this air of authority about him, but in a way that wasn't intimidating. He was the kind of boss who could give you a task and expect it done, but would always be around to chat if you needed help. He had been with the company since it was just a handful of people working out of a cramped apartment, and now, as the company grew, he had turned into the kind of leader who kept things running smoothly. There was also Sarah, our head of marketing. Sarah was in her late 20s, smart, focused, and often buried in her work, but she had a dry sense of humor that would pop up at the most unexpected times. She'd been with the company for a couple of years, and in that time, she'd become someone I could count on. She was the kind of person who would stay late just to make sure a campaign was perfect. We worked together on many projects, and I can say that when things were calm, she was a reliable teammate. And then there was Tom, the other guy. Tom was a bit of a mystery to everyone in the office. He didn't talk much and kept to himself. He had a knack for solving technical issues that no one else could, but beyond that, he didn't seem interested in socializing with the rest of us. He was quiet, unassuming, and liked to work in the evenings when the office was empty. The office routine, like in most places, was built on a cycle of mundane tasks. Everyone came in at 9 a.m. and left around 5 p.m., following the usual workweek rhythm. Most of us did our best to get our work done during the day, but with deadlines always creeping up and the pressure to meet client demands, there was a certain comfort in staying after hours. That was the case for me, at least. On a normal day, the office would start to empty out by around 6 p.m. People would grab their bags, say their goodbyes, and head out. The lights in the hallway would get switched off one by one until there were only a few scattered desks still occupied. The hum of the air conditioning and the soft tapping of keyboards would be the only sounds left. For the most part, I enjoyed the quiet. There was a kind of peacefulness to being the last one left. I could focus more, think clearer, and just get lost in my work without distractions. Plus, I never minded being alone in the office. There was a strange comfort in it, maybe because, for me, being in a building at night meant I could control everything. The stillness, the calm, all of it was mine. But then there were the nights when I would look around and feel the weight of the silence in a way that unsettled me. It wasn't just the emptiness of the building, it was the sense that something was watching. A presence that wasn't human, something that didn't belong. But at that point, it was easy to dismiss. After all, it was just an old office building. It wasn't the first time I had worked alone at night. The first few weeks in the office, nothing out of the ordinary happened. There were no strange sounds, no unexplained events, just the normal ebb and flow of office life. The days were busy and filled with meetings and presentations, and the nights were spent typing away, making calls, and finishing up tasks. There was the usual clink of coffee cups in the break room, the rustling of papers, and the chatter of coworkers making plans for the weekend. But as time passed, a few things started to change. Little by little, there was a shift. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was noticeable if you paid attention. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder. The elevators seemed to make strange noises when no one was around, and sometimes the lights in the hallways would flicker. At first, I chalked it up to the quirks of an old building. But as I spent more time working those late shifts, those little quirks started to feel less like normal office noises and more like something else, something that couldn't quite be explained. It wasn't until that night, when I was working alone in the office, that I started to realize just how strange things had become. It started off so small that I barely noticed it at first. That's the thing with strange occurrences, they tend to slip under the radar until they pile up enough to become impossible to ignore. The first sign, the very first odd thing that happened, was something I could have easily explained away. It was just another late evening. The office was quiet, and I was alone, typing away on my computer. I had just wrapped up a project that had been looming over me for days. As usual, the building was darkening with every passing hour, the lights overhead flickering occasionally. I remember looking at the clock. It was about 10:30 p.m. The city outside was still bustling, the occasional car honking in the distance, but inside the office, it was a different world. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard as I tried to finish up a report. The sound was oddly comforting. My mind was focused on the task at hand, but my body was slowly feeling the fatigue from hours of work. I stretched in my chair, rubbing my eyes, when I noticed something out of place. The fluorescent light above me flickered. Just for a second. A stuttered flicker. Nothing too alarming. It happened sometimes, a result of the old wiring in the building or the power grid being a little shaky. Still, I couldn't shake the slight discomfort that came over me, a fleeting feeling that something wasn't quite right. I shrugged it off, deciding it was just a quirk of the office. After all, I had been here long enough to know that the building had its little issues. But then, as I went back to work, I heard a faint sound. At first, it was so subtle that I thought it was just the air conditioning kicking in. It had that kind of hum to it, a constant background noise that you often forget is there. But this time, it sounded different. A soft, distant tapping. Almost like a knock, but faint and irregular, like someone was tapping their fingers against the surface. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. My mind tried to rationalize it, to explain it away. It was probably just someone in another office, maybe one of the cleaning staff, working late. But that didn't make sense. The cleaning crew didn't come around until much later in the evening, and all the other offices on our floor had been vacant for hours. I glanced out the window into the parking lot below, but there were no cars left except mine. I listened closely. There it was again, 3 soft taps. I glanced toward the door, half expecting someone to walk in. But there was no one. Just the faint glow of the emergency exit signs down the hallway, casting an eerie red light that made the shadows in the office stretch long and deep. I hesitated for a moment, then shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the pipes, or some old part of the building settling. But when I tried to focus on my work again, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I stood up from my desk, deciding to stretch my legs and grab a quick coffee from the break room. It was a small act of comfort, a way to clear my head and stop overthinking things. As I walked down the hallway toward the break room, the lights flickered again, but this time it lasted longer. The lights dimmed, then brightened back up in slow increments. I stopped in my tracks, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something felt off, the kind of off that's hard to describe. A sensation that made you question if you were imagining things or if the building itself was somehow reacting. I reached the break room and grabbed a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the weird feeling that was settling in. Maybe I was just overtired. I had been working long hours lately, and exhaustion can play tricks on your mind. I sipped the hot coffee, hoping the warm drink would help, but I couldn't shake the sense that the office around me had changed. It wasn't just the noises or the flickering lights. It was a deeper, more instinctive feeling, like something in the air was different. Something in the building itself had shifted. I walked back to my desk, trying to tell myself it was nothing. After all, buildings do make noises, don't they? They creak and settle. Maybe there was something about the electrical system that caused the lights to behave this way. But as I sat back down, I couldn't ignore the sense that the office wasn't as lifeless as it should have been. The next few days were uneventful, and I pushed the strange experience out of my mind. It was just a one-off, I convinced myself. A coincidence, or perhaps a trick of the imagination. Life at the office carried on with the usual rhythm of work, meetings, and deadlines. But then, something else happened, something that made me question everything I had known about that building. It was another late shift, just a few days after the first odd incident. I was staying late again, trying to get ahead on a project. The office was, as usual, quiet. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. My fingers were starting to ache from typing so much, and I felt my eyes grow heavy. But I pushed on. I had a deadline. I had just finished reviewing a report when I heard it again, the soft tapping sound. Only this time, it was louder, more deliberate. I froze, sitting up straight in my chair. The tapping was coming from the hallway. It wasn't just a random sound anymore. Someone was knocking, but not at the door to my office. The noise was echoing down the hallway, like someone was walking up and down, tapping their fingers on the walls. My heart began to race. There was no one else in the building. I was certain of it. I had checked the parking lot again, and the only cars left were mine and a few others on the street. The building was locked up for the night. I grabbed my phone, ready to call Greg or Sarah, or anyone who might still be awake, but something made me hesitate. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was the stress or the late hours. But as I stood up to check the hallway, the sound stopped. It wasn't like the tapping had faded away. It just stopped, as though whoever or whatever had been making it had suddenly decided to leave. The silence that followed felt heavier, thicker, the kind of silence that stretches out and makes everything feel unsettling. I stood there for a long time, staring down the dark hallway. The flickering lights above me did nothing to calm my nerves. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't just sit there anymore. I had to check it out. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, my senses on high alert. Every little noise seemed magnified in the darkened hallway. When I reached the end, I paused, listening. There was nothing, just the usual hum of the building and the soft creak of the walls. No signs of anyone else being there. I slowly turned back and walked back to my office, still unsure of what I had heard. My mind raced as I sat down, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a normal situation. There was something in that building. Something that didn't belong. Something that made the hair on my neck stand on end every time I thought about it. The tapping wasn't just the beginning, it was a sign that things were about to get much, much stranger. The strange events became more frequent after that night. It started with the flickering lights, then the tapping sounds, followed by a sudden chill in the air that couldn't be explained away by the building's old heating system. I remember the first time the temperature dropped so suddenly, without warning. It was as though someone had opened a freezer door in the middle of the room, and the cool air rushed in, biting at my skin. I glanced at the thermostat, but it showed no change in the temperature. It was an odd feeling that made the hairs on my neck stand on end, like the building itself had shifted its mood. At first, I thought maybe it was just my exhaustion from working too many long hours. I told myself that the flickering lights were just a result of the old electrical system, that the strange coldness was due to some draft or malfunctioning air conditioning. But as the days wore on, the oddities grew harder to ignore, and the building felt more and more like it was alive. The strange events seemed to escalate, one after the other. The lights flickered more often. Sometimes they didn't flicker at all, just dimmed, as if something was draining their energy. I would walk down the hallway, and the hallway lights would blink out one by one as I passed, only to come back on once I had walked farther away. The sound of footsteps following mine became a regular occurrence, each set of steps seeming to match the rhythm of my own. But when I turned around, there was never anyone there. And then there was the knocking, faint, distant tapping that would echo down the halls at the oddest times, always when I was alone. It was as though something was trying to get my attention, though I had no idea what. The worst part was how the atmosphere of the building seemed to change. It wasn't just the physical changes, the temperature drops, the flickering lights, the strange sounds, but something deeper, something unsettling that crept into my gut. The air in the office seemed heavier, thicker, as though the building itself had a presence, a consciousness that was aware of my every move. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, especially when I was sitting at my desk, typing away. It was like someone was standing behind me, watching me, waiting for me to turn around. It wasn't just me feeling this. I could tell. There were moments when I'd catch a glimpse of Sarah or Greg, their eyes darting nervously around the room, their hands trembling slightly when they reached for their coffee cups. They knew something was wrong too, but none of us said it aloud. Maybe it was easier to pretend we were all imagining things, that it was just the stress of work and late hours getting to us. But as the days went by, it became more and more impossible to ignore. I started to question my own sanity. Was I really hearing things, or was the building actually coming alive? I remember one night, long after everyone had left, I sat at my desk, staring at the screen. The building was quieter than usual, no tapping, no flickering lights. But there was something different about the silence. It felt oppressive. And just as I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, not even a whisper, but it was clear enough to make me freeze in place. A soft, distant voice, calling my name. It came from somewhere far down the hallway, too far for anyone to be standing there. It sounded almost familiar, like a friend calling out to me. I stood up, my heart racing. I glanced down the hallway, but there was no one there. The lights were dim, casting long dark shadows along the walls. I called out, half expecting someone to reply, but there was only silence. I slowly walked toward the sound, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking through some thick fog that clouded my mind. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand what was happening to this place. As I reached the end of the hallway, I stopped. There was nothing. The voice had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I turned around and headed back to my office, my nerves on edge. But just as I was about to step through the door, I heard it again. This time, closer. I froze in the doorway, my hand gripping the handle so tightly that my knuckles went white. The voice was clearer now, more distinct. It was almost as if it was coming from within the walls themselves, calling out, whispering my name. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the office, racing down the hallway toward the main exit. The sound of my own breathing was the only thing I could hear, the echo of my footsteps pounding in my ears. I reached the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, but the elevator doors didn't open. The button flashed, but the elevator didn't move. The lights flickered, and I felt a sudden weight in my chest, as though the building itself was holding me in place, refusing to let me leave. I hit the button again, my hand shaking, but the doors stayed closed. Panic began to set in. I pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. I turned to run for the stairs, but then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move, just a shadow, but it was enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. It was as if something or someone was standing in the corner of the hallway, watching me. I turned and ran down the stairs, not bothering to look back. I don't know how long I was running, but by the time I reached the ground floor, my legs were aching and my breathing was ragged. The building was silent again, the lights bright and steady, as though nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather myself, but the sense of unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. I had to get out. I couldn't stay there another minute. I grabbed my things and rushed out the front door, not caring if anyone saw me. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The city was quiet, the streets empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. But even as I walked away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. It was as if the presence in that office had latched onto me, lingering just beyond the edge of my perception. And as I glanced back at the darkened windows of the building, I couldn't help but feel that the office was watching me, waiting for me to return. The tension in my chest refused to fade. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds of the office, the flickering lights, and that voice had all replayed in my mind over and over again. The building wasn't just haunted by some lingering spirit. It was something more, something alive, something that had been waiting for me, watching, biding its time. It knew me, and somehow I knew it wasn't done with me yet. It was a week after I had run from the office, my mind still consumed with the unsettling events that had unfolded. I had returned to my apartment and tried to bury the memories of the flickering lights, the chilling air, and that voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But no matter how hard I tried, the unease lingered. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the office was still there, haunting me, waiting for me to come back. I should have stayed away. I knew that, but I couldn't. There was something in me, something I couldn't quite explain, that told me I had unfinished business. The night was closing in, and as much as I tried to push the thought from my mind, I found myself once again walking back toward the office. This time, I wasn't alone. Sarah and Greg had been experiencing the same strange occurrences. We had all talked about it, tried to brush it off, and convinced ourselves it was just the stress. But deep down, we knew that wasn't true. There was something in that building, something waiting for us. It was a quiet night when we all arrived, the building empty except for the three of us. The hum of the fluorescent lights above our heads was the only sound as we stood together in the lobby, a shared sense of unease settling between us. The air was thick with tension, the same oppressive weight I had felt before, but stronger this time. We weren't here to just leave. We had come to find out what was happening, to confront whatever had been lurking in the shadows of this place. We walked through the halls, our footsteps echoing as we made our way down the narrow corridors. Each door we passed seemed to hold a secret, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. Every flicker of light, every faint sound made my pulse quicken. But it wasn't until we reached the old storage room on the far side of the building that everything changed. I remember that moment clearly. The door to the storage room had always been locked. No one ever went inside, not even the janitors. But tonight, as we approached the door, it was open just slightly, enough for us to see a sliver of darkness beyond. The door didn't creak when it moved, it just opened. I felt my heart race. Something about that door, about what was behind it, pulled at me, like it was calling me to come closer. I wasn't the only one who felt it. I could see it in Sarah's eyes, the way her hand hovered near the door, hesitant but almost compelled. We all stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Greg was the first to speak, breaking the silence with a voice that trembled slightly. Should we go in? There was no immediate answer. We all knew what was in that room, what had to be in that room. But at the same time, none of us could look away from the darkness, the way it seemed to shift, almost as if it were alive. A chill spread through the air, colder than anything we had felt before. It was as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for us. Let's just get this over with, I said, my voice shaking, but with a determination I didn't fully understand. We need to know what's going on here. We stepped inside, the door creaking softly as it shut behind us. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the emergency exit signs above. The air was heavy with dust, and the faint smell of something stale lingered in the back of my throat. The room was empty except for the strange symbols drawn on the floor. They weren't words, not exactly. They were shapes, patterns, intricate and complex, drawn in what looked like chalk or some other pale substance. The symbols formed a large circle in the center of the room, and I could feel a strange pull toward them, as if they were drawing me in. It was like I was being called to them, the way a moth is drawn to a flame. Look at this, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She bent down to inspect the markings. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. What does this mean? I looked down at the symbols, my pulse pounding in my ears. The more I looked at them, the more I felt as if they were watching me. I stepped closer, my legs heavy as though the air had thickened around me. The room seemed smaller now, more claustrophobic, and I could feel the walls pressing in. I reached down, my fingers hovering over one of the markings, but before I could touch it, a sound stopped me cold. It was a low, guttural growl, deep and almost inhuman. The sound came from somewhere far behind us, a noise that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. We froze, all of us, every muscle in our bodies locking in terror. The growl echoed again, louder this time, and the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath, a mist forming in the air in front of me. My heart was racing, and I felt the overwhelming urge to run. But the thing in the darkness wasn't going to let us leave that easily. I turned to look at Greg and Sarah, but they weren't beside me anymore. I felt my stomach drop, and my gaze snapped back to the center of the room, where something was moving. It wasn't just the shadows that shifted, it was the floor itself. The markings on the floor seemed to writhe, like they were alive, twisting and turning into new shapes that didn't make sense. And then, out of the shadows, it appeared. At first, it was just a figure, a silhouette in the darkness. But as it came into the light, I could see it clearly. A man, or what had once been a man. His body was contorted in unnatural ways, as though it had been twisted and broken. His face was pale, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. His arms were too long, and his fingers were tipped with sharp, jagged nails that scraped against the floor with every step. The thing, whatever it was, moved toward us, its head swiveling unnaturally to track our every movement. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't even think. My body was frozen in place, my mind screaming for me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. Greg was the first to react. He pushed Sarah behind him, his voice shaking as he shouted, "Stay back. Don't come any closer." But his words were nothing more than a desperate plea. The creature didn't stop, it didn't even hesitate. It was as if it wanted us to see it, to feel its presence in every inch of our skin. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my legs weak beneath me, but the thing in front of me was the true terror. It was real, and it was coming closer, its every movement disturbing and unnatural. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. It vanished into the shadows, leaving only the faintest echo of its growl behind. The room fell silent. The oppressive air lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time, waiting for me to move. I stood there for a moment, motionless, trying to gather my bearings, but it felt like the building itself was pressing in on me, urging me to leave. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but I had to be sure. I had to know what was real and what wasn't. I turned to Greg and Sarah, my voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't need to say anything else. Without another word, we ran out of that room, out of the building, and into the night. My heart was pounding, my breath ragged, and I didn't dare look back. But as we ran, I could feel it, the presence of that thing, still lingering, still watching us from the darkness. We didn't speak much after leaving the office that night. The silence between Sarah, Greg, and I was deafening, each of us processing the events in our own way. As we reached the safety of the street, the heavy weight that had settled in my chest began to loosen, but only slightly. We had escaped the building, but I could still feel the cold, unsettling presence of whatever had been waiting for us there. My mind refused to let go of the images, the dark figure, the growls, the twisted symbols. And I couldn't shake the sensation that something had followed us, that the nightmare wasn't over. We never spoke of the incident again, not directly anyway. The next few days at work were painfully normal. There was no mention of what had happened, and the office seemed to have returned to its usual hum. But I knew it hadn't just been a figment of our imaginations. Something real had occurred, and we were all affected by it. I had hoped that walking away, leaving the building, would be enough to sever the connection between us and whatever force had been at work there. But as the days turned into weeks, the uneasy feeling never fully faded. The images still lingered in my thoughts, and sometimes, late at night, I would hear noises, scratching sounds, soft taps on the walls that would send my heart racing. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. It was as if the office was still calling me, beckoning me back to finish what I had started. Sarah, too, seemed changed. She spent her days distracted, often lost in thought, as though she were haunted by something that she couldn't articulate. She wouldn't come near the office building anymore, avoiding even the area where it stood. Greg had taken to spending most of his time at home, rarely socializing. The experience had shaken us all, and none of us felt like we were the same anymore. But we were left with no answers, no closure. The building stood silent, empty, and uninviting. The strange events, the eerie atmosphere, had simply stopped once we fled. And yet, we couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery of it all remained unsolved. I returned to the office a few days later, but I couldn't bring myself to step inside. I hovered outside, staring up at the darkened windows, searching for any sign of what had happened. The building loomed in front of me, its once familiar facade now feeling foreign and menacing. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around me, but the sounds of the city seemed muffled in comparison to the stillness of the office. I could feel the unease growing within me, but it wasn't just fear, it was unfinished business. There was something I hadn't done, something I hadn't resolved. But what? What was there to resolve? What had happened? The feeling gnawed at me, a constant reminder that I hadn't fully faced whatever it was that we had encountered. And yet, every time I considered going back, the memory of that room, the symbols, the figure stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I wasn't sure I ever would. The office remained standing, but I couldn't bring myself to visit again. It was as though the building held a piece of me that I couldn't quite reclaim, and the thought of returning to it only felt like opening a door that should remain closed. I had no answers. I wasn't sure I wanted them. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of life continued. I tried to go back to normal, to move on from the horror of that night. But the question remained, was it over? Or was something still waiting, still hidden, just beyond the edges of my vision? I never found the answers, and I'm not sure I ever will. I don't know if I was ever meant to understand what happened, or if it was something that was simply beyond my comprehension. But as time went on, the memories faded, and the weight of that night began to loosen its grip. I went back to work, took on new projects, and started to feel the faintest sense of normalcy again. Yet, in the back of my mind, there was always that nagging feeling, like something had been left behind, something unfinished, something I would never fully understand. The events that occurred that night, in that place, would stay with me for the rest of my life. I couldn't explain them. I couldn't forget them. And maybe that was the point. Sometimes there are things in this world that are meant to remain a mystery, unanswered, unsolved. But the memory of that building, of the strange events, would remain a shadow in my mind, a reminder of how little we truly understand about the world around us. And though I will never forget what happened, I have learned to accept it for what it is. There are things we will never know, things we are not meant to understand. And sometimes, the only choice we have is to let it go, to move forward, even without the answers. But every now and then, when I find myself alone in the dark, I can still hear it, the low, guttural growl, the echo of something that waits in the shadows. And though I can't explain it, I know that it hasn't gone away. It's still there, watching, waiting, just out of reach. I can't say I fully understand what took place within that office building, or why it had such an unsettling grip on us. All I know is that it wasn't just a product of our imaginations, a bad night, or some overblown reaction to stress. It was something real, something that touched the very core of our being. Now, months later, the lingering presence that haunted us still weighs on me. It's strange, isn't it? How some experiences, especially the ones we can't fully explain, seem to stick with you, even as time moves on. There's an emptiness in not knowing, in never truly understanding what happened that night. And yet, there's also something liberating in that uncertainty, because the unknown is something we must come to terms with in life. We can't have answers for everything. Some things are just meant to remain out of our grasp. The building is still standing. I drive past it on occasion, but I can't bring myself to stop. Every time I see it, I feel a rush of cold air in my chest, a tightening in my throat. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or if there really is something about that place, something beyond our comprehension that still lingers there. The energy is different now. It feels dormant, as though waiting for something. But it's not my problem anymore. I've walked away, and maybe, for better or worse, that's how things are meant to be left unfinished. Sarah and Greg, they're fine in their own ways. Sarah moved to a new job after that night. She tried to talk about it once or twice, but the words never came out the way she intended, so she stopped trying. Greg has remained in the same office, but he hasn't spoken about that night to anyone. Neither of us ever really talked about it again, not in any meaningful way. Sometimes we'll share a look across the room, a silent acknowledgement of something shared, something terrifying we'll never be able to fully explain. And maybe that's where the real fear lies, not in what we encountered in that building, but in the fact that we'll never have the answers. That is a terrifying thought in its own right. But despite the unanswered questions, the fear, and the mystery that remains, there is one thing I've learned through it all. We are far more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. We survived that night. We made it through, and we kept moving forward. That's what life asks of us, isn't it? To keep going, even when we don't fully understand everything that happens around us. This one's a little different. It's not about something you might expect to be terrifying at first glance. It's the kind of story that creeps up on you, slowly and subtly, leaving you with questions that might never be answered. So sit back, let the world around you fall away for a while, and open your mind to the strange and eerie. This all began a few years ago in the quiet, suburban neighborhood where my family and I lived. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, where the sounds of lawnmowers and kids playing could be heard throughout the summer, and where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Life, for the most part, was routine. Nothing more unsettling than an argument over who parked too close to the curb or the occasional dog barking too loudly in the middle of the night. At the time, I was living with my parents, my older brother, and my younger sister. Nothing extraordinary to report about any of us, just your average family living in a quiet town, going about our lives. My dad worked at a local firm. My mom had recently started volunteering at a nearby community center, and my brother and sister were still in school. I had just started my own job in the city, and most of my days were filled with the usual grind. Commuting, working, coming home, and trying to squeeze in some relaxation. We didn't have many visitors, aside from the occasional relatives or neighbors popping by for a quick chat. That was until one evening when things started to shift. It was a Friday night, and I had just wrapped up a long week at work. As usual, I was looking forward to a quiet evening in. My brother, who had just turned 22, was sitting in the living room, his feet propped up on the coffee table as he scrolled through his phone. My younger sister was in her room, most likely engrossed in her schoolwork or a book, as she usually was. It was the perfect end to a long week, nothing out of the ordinary. Then it happened. Around 8:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. Not an uncommon occurrence, but this time, something felt different. At first, we didn't even think to question it after all. Who would be stopping by so late? But there was something about the ring that caught our attention, lingering just a moment longer than usual. We all glanced at each other, exchanging puzzled looks. No one was expecting anyone. My brother, being the closest to the door, stood up and walked over to answer it. He opened the door with his usual nonchalance, probably expecting it to be a delivery or a neighbor who needed to borrow something. But when he saw who was standing there, his expression changed frozen, almost confused. He blinked twice, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Standing on the doorstep was someone we didn't recognize. A woman, maybe in her mid-40s, with short, graying hair, wearing a thick winter coat despite the mild evening. She looked worn, as though she had been through something difficult, but there was a strange calmness to her, like she belonged in this moment, even though none of us knew her. "Can I help you?" my brother asked, though there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. The woman simply looked at him, and then without speaking nodded. My brother stepped back, unsure of what to do. "Mom, Dad," he called out. Our parents, hearing the commotion, came rushing to the door. By now, I had joined them in the hallway, curiosity bubbling up inside me. The woman stepped into the doorway, her eyes scanning each of us, almost as if she were trying to place us, though none of us had ever seen her before. "I'm sorry, I think I have the wrong house," she said finally, her voice a little shaky. But even as she said it, her gaze didn't leave us. She almost seemed to be waiting for something, a reaction, perhaps before adding, "I've been looking for someone." The tension in the room was palpable. We all exchanged confused glances. My mom took a step forward, trying to ease the awkwardness. "Are you sure you have the right house?" she asked gently. "Who are you looking for?" The woman hesitated. Then she said something that chilled me to my core. "I've been trying to find my daughter. She's been missing for a long time. I was told she might be here." None of us knew how to respond to that. We didn't know anyone who had gone missing recently. And yet, her words hung in the air, heavy with an unsettling truth. My mom stepped back, visibly startled, but tried to remain composed. "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that name here. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The woman's expression softened, but her eyes darkened with a strange sadness. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. "I must have made a mistake." With that, she turned and began walking away. We all stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. What had she meant by all that? Who was she looking for? And why had she come to our house, of all places? As she disappeared into the night, none of us could shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. In the days that followed, we tried to push the encounter out of our minds, chalking it up to some sort of mistake or misunderstanding. But then, things started to get stranger. Little by little, we began noticing things that didn't add up, things that slowly started unraveling the sense of peace we had in our quiet home. After the strange encounter with the woman at the door, the initial shock faded into a nervous tension that seemed to hang over our home. At first, we tried to dismiss it. My parents, in particular, didn't want to dwell on the encounter. They chalked it up to the possibility that the woman had simply gotten the wrong house, or perhaps she had been going through a difficult time. It was a reasonable explanation, except for one thing. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on. Something I couldn't explain. There was an eerie sense to the way the woman had looked at us, the way her gaze lingered just a little too long. It felt like she was searching for something she thought she'd find in our house. I couldn't get the image of her out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see her standing there, on the doorstep, that strange expression on her face. My brother felt the same. We both spent the rest of the evening in quiet contemplation, occasionally exchanging looks, as though we were waiting for something more to happen. But nothing did. That night, everything seemed normal again. The world continued to spin in its familiar rhythm, the sounds of cars passing by, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft murmur of voices from my parents' room. But the calm didn't last long. A few days later, I came home late from work. I had stayed a little longer at the office than usual, hoping to get ahead on a project. When I walked through the door, I was greeted by an odd silence. Normally, the house would have been buzzing with activity. My younger sister would have been finishing her homework at the kitchen table. My brother might have been playing video games in the living room, and my parents would have been preparing dinner or talking about their day. But that evening, there was no noise, no conversation, just an unsettling quiet. I called out to my family, but no one answered. I thought maybe they had stepped outside or gone for a walk, but the moment I entered the living room, something caught my eye. The TV was on, the volume low, but it was showing static, a picture of nothing but random black and white pixels flickering across the screen. My heart rate quickened. I didn't understand why the TV would be on, especially with no one around. The oddness of the scene was made worse by the fact that the static on the screen seemed to be getting more intense, almost as if it were alive, moving and shifting in strange, chaotic patterns. I turned the TV off, but as soon as the screen went black, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, something I couldn't immediately explain. The light in the hallway seemed to flicker. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but then it became more pronounced, as though the bulb was struggling to stay on. I walked down the hall, hoping to find my family and reassure myself that everything was normal. But the further I went, the more unsettling it became. My parents' room was dark, the door closed. My brother's room was empty, and so was my sister's. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but it sounded different, somehow louder, more invasive. I reached for my phone, ready to call my parents, but before I could dial, the kitchen light flickered, and I heard a soft sound, a faint tapping noise, like fingernails drumming on the countertop. I froze, my heart pounding. The noise wasn't coming from anywhere specific, it was just there. And it wasn't normal. It didn't make sense. I stepped cautiously into the kitchen, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of what might have caused the noise. The tapping continued, more insistent now, like a rhythmic pattern. But when I looked around, the kitchen was empty. No one was there. Nothing had fallen or moved. My hands trembled as I reached for the light switch. The instant I flipped it on, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it just my imagination? Or was there something in the house that was making its presence known? I didn't know what to think, but the strange sensation of unease settled over me like a heavy weight. The house felt different now, almost as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting. I wanted to call out to my family, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt off, Just as I was about to call my brother to check on him, I heard the sound of footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, like someone was walking just out of view. I turned, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, circling around the house, as though they were coming from every direction at once. I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from, but the sensation of being followed, of being watched, became overwhelming. My chest tightened, and a sense of panic gripped me. I quickly ran upstairs, the noise still echoing in my mind, and went to my sister's room. I knocked gently on the door, calling her name softly, not sure what I expected. But when I opened the door, I was taken aback. She wasn't there. Her bed was made, and her room was exactly how it had been that morning when I left for work. But there was something different about it. The air felt thick, heavier, as though it had been disturbed. I could almost smell the faint scent of something unfamiliar, like damp earth, mingling with the faint perfume of her room. I quickly checked my brother's room, hoping he'd be there, but found nothing. He wasn't in his usual spot on the couch either. I went downstairs and checked the kitchen again, but the eerie stillness remained. Something was definitely wrong. I called my parents, but there was no answer. In a panic, I rushed outside, half expecting to find them standing on the porch, or maybe talking to a neighbor. But the porch was empty. The whole street was quiet. I was about to go back inside when I heard the faintest sound, a soft voice, coming from somewhere behind me. "Don't leave." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It came from the direction of the house, and yet no one was there. I turned around quickly, but saw nothing but the darkening sky and the familiar, quiet street. My pulse raced as I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to explain the dread that had settled in my chest. I couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong, and yet I was alone in this feeling. My family was missing, but where had they gone? Was I alone in the house now? Or was something else waiting for me in the dark? I couldn't bring myself to search the entire house again. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to be able to ignore the strange events for much longer. Something was happening here, something that none of us understood. It had been 3 days since I first noticed the strange occurrences around the house, but things only seemed to get worse. The unease that had once been a subtle, nagging feeling had now become a constant presence. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, every flicker of the lights, it all felt like something was building, something I couldn't see, but could feel creeping closer with each passing hour. At first, I tried to brush off the feelings of dread, but when I saw the shadows moving in the corners of my vision, when the air grew inexplicably heavy, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The house itself seemed to have taken on a different life, one that was no longer comforting or familiar. It felt as though the walls were pressing in on me, the ceilings low and oppressive, and the floor beneath me unsteady. Everything felt like it was changing, warping, and I could do nothing but watch as it unfolded. The strange occurrences escalated rapidly. It started with the temperature in the house. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, trying to distract myself from the growing tension, when I felt a sudden drop in temperature. I hadn't touched the thermostat, and yet the air in the living room had grown cold, almost bone-chilling. The warmth that had once filled the house seemed to have vanished. It wasn't just the usual chill that comes with nighttime, it was different, colder, more invasive. I shivered and rubbed my arms, trying to ignore it, but the cold lingered, wrapping itself around me. I stood up, my mind racing, trying to figure out what could cause such an abrupt shift in temperature. I walked toward the kitchen, but the cold seemed to follow me. It clung to the walls, making the floor feel slick and uncomfortable underfoot. The light in the hallway flickered again, casting brief, erratic shadows that danced across the walls. I stopped, frozen in place. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned toward the kitchen. There was a faint sound, a soft scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate, until it was unmistakable. It was coming from the pantry. Slowly, I walked toward it, the cold air seeping deeper into my skin with every step. I reached out to open the door, but the moment my hand touched the handle, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I hesitated, my fingers lingering on the door handle. I didn't know what I was expecting to find behind it, but I felt an overwhelming urge to check. With a deep breath, I opened the door, half expecting something to jump out at me. But there was nothing. The pantry was exactly as it had been earlier that day, empty shelves, bags of flour and sugar stacked neatly in the corner. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that it had just been my imagination. But then I noticed something strange. One of the cans on the bottom shelf and an open can of soup was tilted slightly. Not enough to fall over, but enough that it was clear it had been moved. I knelt down and reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal, and as I lifted it, I saw something even more unsettling. The label was partially scratched off, as though something had intentionally rubbed it away. My heart began to pound in my chest. I had no explanation for what I was seeing. The pantry door hadn't opened on its own. No one had been in the kitchen, and no one had touched the can. I placed it back on the shelf and quickly closed the pantry door, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it all. The unsettling events didn't stop there. Over the next few days, the house seemed to grow increasingly hostile. Objects would shift when no one was around. My brother's gaming console, normally left neatly on the table, was found in the middle of the living room floor, its wires tangled and pulled out of the socket. My sister's favorite mug was found shattered on the kitchen counter, although she swore she hadn't touched it. And the lights, the lights, they flickered constantly, often going out for seconds at a time before suddenly coming back on, like the house was playing some cruel game of hide and seek. One evening, while I was sitting alone in the living room, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a low hum, almost like a distant growl or a muffled voice. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't normal either. The noise seemed to be coming from upstairs. I stood up quickly, my breath shallow, and walked toward the staircase. The sound grew louder, more distinct, but I still couldn't make out any words. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, frozen, listening to the unsettling hum. Then it stopped. I waited, my heart thumping in my chest, but there was nothing. Only silence. The kind of silence that felt like it was suffocating me. I slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight, my ears straining to hear anything, any clue that might explain the strange noises I'd been hearing. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hallway, toward my parents' room. I knocked gently at the door, but got no response. I pushed it open, and there, on the bed, was my mother. She was lying still, her eyes wide open, but there was something wrong, something in the way she stared at the ceiling, as if she were seeing something that wasn't there. "Mom?" I asked quietly, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Her body was completely still, unnaturally so, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I took a step closer, trying to shake her gently, but as soon as I touched her shoulder, she turned to face me. Her eyes were glassy, unblinking, and her mouth opened as though she were about to speak. But nothing came out. I pulled my hand back, my stomach churning with fear. I turned and ran downstairs, but when I reached the bottom, I realized that my brother and sister were gone. The house, once so familiar, now felt empty, hollow. I called out for them, but there was no answer. The silence had returned, but this time it felt like it was closing in on me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was getting worse. The house was no longer a safe place. It was a place of growing fear, filled with things that couldn't be explained. The tension was palpable, and with every passing moment, it felt like the house was pushing me further into a corner. I knew I couldn't stay there alone, but the fear of what might be lurking in the shadows kept me rooted to the spot. The fear of whatever had taken my family, of whatever was now taking over the house, consumed me. I could feel it. The walls were closing in. The investigation began. With each new event, I became more determined to find out what was happening. I started searching the house, room by room, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. I checked the basement, even though it felt like stepping into the mouth of darkness itself. I searched the attic, convinced there was something I had missed. I didn't know what I was looking for: footprints, strange symbols, any sign that could explain the strange noises, the cold spots, the disappearances. But every room I entered only brought more questions, more unanswered fears. I wasn't alone in my quest. The fear had spread to my friends, and they began to help me search, though their presence did little to ease the growing tension in the house. We could all feel it. The house was changing, and something far darker than we could comprehend was taking shape in the corners. Every investigation, every new piece of the puzzle, only led to more confusion. The houses felt like a maze, one that we were all trapped in, desperately trying to find a way out. But with each step we took, the houses seemed to shift, and the walls grew tighter. The air grew heavier, and the shadows, they grew longer. By this point, the house had become an entity in itself, its very presence oppressing us, suffocating us. Each room we entered felt colder, and each corner held a new threat. The sounds had become constant, a constant hum that seemed to vibrate through the floors, walls, and ceilings. The walls, once a comforting backdrop to daily life, now loomed like watchful, silent guardians. At night, we huddled together, staying in the same room, unable to escape the sensation that something was lurking just beyond our sight. It had become impossible to ignore the feeling that we were no longer living in a home, but in a place that was not ours. And then it happened. It started with a sudden loud crash, something that shook the very foundations of the house. The sound came from upstairs, from my parents' room, the very room that had already been the source of so many unsettling events. Without thinking, I bolted up from the couch where my brother and sister and I had been sitting. The air in the house felt suffocating, the space around us closing in. The noise had come from upstairs, from behind the door of my parents' room. The door that, for the past few days, had been left ajar, as if someone was waiting for us to open it. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam slicing through the heavy darkness of the hallway as I made my way toward the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the fear crawling under my skin, creeping along my spine. My hands shook as I gripped the banister, the old wood feeling slick beneath my fingers. The air was thick, too thick, and it had the smell of old, damp earth, a scent that felt wrong, like decay. When I reached the top of the stairs, the light in the hallway flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. I turned the corner toward my parents' room, but before I could even touch the door, I heard a soft, low moan coming from within the room. The sound was chilling, as though it came from deep within the earth itself, reverberating through my very bones. I stood frozen, staring at the door, knowing that something beyond it had been waiting for us. The moan grew louder, more distinct, almost like a chant, a strange, rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo through the house. With every passing second, the air around me grew thicker, colder, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the door slammed open with such force that it rattled the entire frame. I stumbled back, the flashlight trembling in my grip, the beam of light flickering wildly across the room. In the doorway stood a figure, a dark, hunched shape, cloaked in shadow. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that this was just another trick of the light, or a figment of my imagination. But then the figure moved, and the sheer presence of it, its weight, its malevolent force, shattered any hope that this was just in my head. The thing in front of me was not human. Its features were blurred, indistinct, like a smear of darkness, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. It took one slow step forward, and the sound that came from it, a low, guttural growl, sent a rush of cold through me. The creature's hands, if you could call them hands, reached out toward me, long, bony fingers curling and uncurling with every motion. My mind raced as I stumbled backward, but the air felt thick, like I was wading through water, my movements slow and sluggish. The figure stepped into the light, its features becoming clearer, hollow, sunken eyes that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and a mouth that opened wide in a grotesque, gaping grin. The grin wasn't just a smile, it was something twisted, something wrong, as though this thing was mocking me, daring me to scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed, my legs frozen to the floor, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. But then the creature spoke. Its voice was low, gravelly, almost like a whisper, if a whisper could be made of ice and ash. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. The words crawled over me like insects, leaving a trail of icy dread in their wake. And then I heard it, a second voice, faint but unmistakable. A voice I recognized. It was my mother's voice, distorted and slurred, as though she were speaking through water. "Get out," she cried, her voice breaking with fear. "Get out, before it's too late." I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I could hear my family calling my name from downstairs, their voices trembling with terror, but they were distant, unreachable. It was as if the house had swallowed them whole, leaving only this thing in front of me. I gathered every ounce of strength I had and turned to flee. I bolted for the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden floor, but as I reached the bottom step, I felt a cold hand close around my ankle. It was like ice, freezing me in place, and I felt the presence of someone behind me, breathing down my neck. I looked back and saw it. The creature had followed me down the stairs, its eyes gleaming with hunger and malice. Its mouth stretched open wider, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that seemed to grow longer with each passing second. I screamed, struggling to break free, but the grip around my ankle tightened, pulling me back toward the thing. In that moment, I thought I was going to die. But then, something unexpected happened. The house groaned, a deep, reverberating sound that seemed to come from the very foundation itself. The walls shook, the ceiling cracked, and I felt a shift in the air, a sudden, overwhelming force that seemed to push the creature back. It let out a screech, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that made my blood run cold. The grip on my ankle loosened, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a surge of hope. I didn't wait to see if the creature would return. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling with fear, and ran toward the front door. The house was shaking violently now, as if it were alive, and I could hear the creature's growls, getting louder, closer. The door was locked, the key nowhere to be found. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the lock, but it was no use. The house wasn't going to let me leave that easily. Then, just as I was about to give up, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Not the creatures, but my brothers. I turned, and there they were, my brother and sister, standing in the doorway, their eyes wide with terror, but alive. They hadn't been taken by the creature. Somehow, they had made it through the chaos. With their help, we managed to pry the door open, and the moment we stepped outside, the house fell silent. The darkness that had engulfed it seemed to recede, as if the very air had been drained from it. We didn't look back as we ran down the street, away from the house, from the nightmare that had almost consumed us. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory lingered, a scar on our minds that we could never fully erase. And as for the house, we never went near it again. It stood there, silent and waiting, as if it were still watching, still waiting for the next person to dare enter its cursed walls. Whatever had been there, whatever had taken shape in that house, was still out there lurking, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. And though I had escaped, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The house still stood, and with it, the darkness. The thing that had reached out for me was still there, in the shadows, biding its time. As we ran through the night, our hearts still racing with the pounding fear of the unknown, we didn't speak a word. None of us dared to look back at the house as we fled. The shadows seemed to stretch further down the street, as if the very night itself had become part of the nightmare we had just escaped. With each step, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive, and all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the frantic breathing of my siblings beside me. We didn't stop until we reached the town's outskirts, far away from that cursed house. Our breaths were ragged, our legs sore from running, but we couldn't bring ourselves to slow down. It was as though something was still chasing us, even though we had left the house behind. We didn't know what had happened, what force had been at work, but I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, this unrelenting, gnawing feeling that we hadn't escaped. We had only temporarily outrun it. When we finally reached a small diner that was still open, we stumbled inside, looking for any semblance of normalcy, but the warmth of the diner felt foreign. The bright lights overhead, the chatter of the few people still awake, felt like a distant memory from a life we no longer knew. My siblings and I sat in a corner booth, our eyes wide, faces pale, barely speaking, as if we were still trapped in some nightmarish reality. The waitress came over, asking if we wanted anything, but we couldn't speak. Our throats were too dry. We simply nodded when she offered us water. She gave us a look, but said nothing, as if she knew there was something wrong, though she could not put it into words. Hours passed, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us here. Something was still with us. We kept our eyes on the door, afraid to see a figure standing in the entryway, its hollow eyes staring back at us, the same chilling grin stretched across its face. Eventually, we left, too exhausted to keep our eyes open any longer, and made our way to a friend's house. We all slept in one room that night, huddled together, afraid to be alone. The darkness still clung to us, refusing to let go. None of us spoke about what had happened in the house. It felt impossible to put words to what we had seen. How do you explain something like that? How do you even begin to talk about a shadowy figure that wasn't human? Something that seemed to exist beyond the rules of reality? The days that followed were a blur of uneasy quiet. The police came by the next morning, but they had nothing to report. There were no signs of forced entry, no break-ins, no damage to the house. They found nothing. Of course, there was no way we could tell them the truth, not without sounding insane. How could I explain to them the strange sounds, the figures that moved in the shadows, the feeling of something always watching? The house was eventually sold to a family that moved in soon after, and life continued, though for us, everything had changed. The nightmares came, every single night. It didn't matter where I went or what I did, the creature, the presence, was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had left something behind, something important, something dangerous. There were days when I thought I saw it again, its eyes peering through the trees, a fleeting shadow darting just beyond my vision. But when I turned to look, it was gone. The terror, however, stayed with me, clinging like the scent of rain on the ground after a storm. In the years since that night, I've tried to forget, tried to bury the memories, to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, that the house wasn't truly haunted, that we hadn't encountered something beyond the realm of reason. But deep down, I knew the truth, that we had experienced something that defied explanation, something that had left a mark on us all. We were never the same after that night. And maybe that's the way it was meant to be. There are some things in life that you can't forget, no matter how hard you try. Some things that leave an imprint on you, no matter how much time passes. The house, what we encountered there, is one of those things. I can't say I ever stopped being afraid of it, even though I didn't go near it again. Every now and then, when I drive by that part of town, I can't help but glance over at the house, even though I know I shouldn't. There's a part of me that wonders if the house still stands, if it's still waiting for its next victim. Perhaps it's best not to know. As for my siblings, we've each moved on with our lives, but every now and then, we'll get together and talk about it, the things we saw, the things we heard, the way the house made us feel. And we all agree on one thing. Something had been there with us. We might never fully understand it, but it was real, and it was something that none of us would ever forget. The strangest thing is that none of us really talk about the creature itself, the thing we saw that night. We don't even speak its name. It's as though acknowledging it somehow gives it power, like calling it into existence again. I don't want to do that. I don't want to give it that power. But sometimes, when the night is still and the world is quiet, I feel it again, the cold presence in the corner of my mind, watching, waiting. The house may be gone, but whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting, watching. And I can't shake the feeling that someday, it will come back for us. And so, I leave this story with you, not as a cautionary tale, but as a warning. Sometimes, there are places in this world that shouldn't be explored. Some doors should remain closed. Some houses should never be entered. And some things should never be confronted. The house may have sold, but the memories linger. As for us, we're left with unanswered questions, with the gnawing uncertainty of whether what we experienced was truly real, or if our minds had simply cracked under the weight of fear. The mystery remains, and the house waits. How something so terrifying, so real, could simply vanish from the world without a trace, leaving only the lingering unease of what happened. I still find myself haunted by the memory of the house, even though I haven't been back since that fateful night. But even more than the house, it's the unanswered questions that have stayed with me, the things we never understood, the forces we couldn't explain. There was something about that place, something about the way it seemed alive in a way that didn't make sense, that still lingers in the corners of my thoughts. I think about how it all ended, how we ran from it, how we thought we were free, only to realize that the weight of the fear had followed us. It's strange, really. You'd think that after all these years, the memories would fade, that the fear would dissipate with time. But it hasn't. It's as though it has woven itself into the fabric of my being. Every creak of the floor, every shadow in the corner of my eye sends a chill down my spine. Every time I see a house at the end of a street, with its windows dark and its doors closed, I find myself thinking of that one we ran from. It's funny, isn't it? How something as ordinary as a house, something so seemingly simple, can be tied to such a deep, visceral fear. But I think that's what makes it all the more unsettling. The fact that it was so ordinary, so familiar, and yet so far from anything we understood. The house is gone now, replaced by something newer, something more normal. But I wonder, is it really gone? How many of us have experienced something we couldn't explain, something that lingered in our minds long after the event was over? How many of us have walked away from something terrifying, only to carry it with us for the rest of our lives, never truly escaping its grip? I've tried to move on, to live my life as best I can. But I still can't help but look over my shoulder to wonder if, someday, it will all come rushing back. Will I see that figure again? Hear that voice? Or is it something we left behind that night, a part of a world we'll never fully understand? There's a part of me that wishes I could go back, confront whatever was there, and finally put it to rest. But another part of me knows better. Some things aren't meant to be faced. Some questions don't need to be answered. In the end, the story of that house, of what happened to us, will remain a mystery, one that may never be solved, one that may never make sense. And maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries, after all, are best left unsolved. But as I finish telling you this story, I want to leave you with a question. Have you ever had a moment where you knew, deep in your bones, that something wasn't right? Something you couldn't explain, something that lingered long after the moment passed? Maybe it's not as dramatic as what happened to us. Maybe it's something smaller, something quieter, but just as unsettling. We all encounter strange things in our lives, things we can't always put into words. And while we may try to forget them, they never really leave us. It was a cold evening in late October when my friends and I arrived at the Pinewood Hotel, a place known in the area for its rich history and eerie reputation. Located on the outskirts of a sleepy town, nestled between the woods, it seemed like the kind of place you'd stay for a quiet weekend away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The hotel was old, but charming, and although its age showed in the creaking floors and faint smell of must in the corners, there was something strangely inviting about it. For some, this would be the perfect retreat. For us, it was the beginning of something we couldn't yet understand. It had been a long drive, the kind that leaves your legs stiff and your mind tired. But when we finally arrived, we were ready to check in and start our weekend getaway. There was a slight chill in the air, and the low hum of wind against the windows seemed to add a sense of quiet anticipation. The hotel's front desk was manned by a middle-aged man with an almost too stern expression, but he greeted us with a nod and a polite smile. "You're here for the weekend?" he asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on us, or the slight pause before he handed over the room keys. I nodded. Yes, just for a couple of nights to unwind. He seemed satisfied with the answer, but there was a moment of tension as he handed me the keys. They weren't your typical hotel keys. These were old-fashioned brass keys, heavy in the hand, like something out of an old mystery novel. The man didn't say much more as he pointed us to the direction of our room, the dim hallway lighting casting long shadows that made the place feel just a little less inviting. We followed his directions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the silence. The hotel wasn't completely empty, but it felt like it was. A quiet sort of emptiness lingered in the corners of the halls, and the sound of our footsteps echoed louder than it should have. The decor, too, had a strange, dated quality to it. Faded carpets, old portraits hanging crookedly on the walls, and the scent of stale air in the hallway made it feel as though the hotel was frozen in time, frozen in an era that didn't want to let go. At first, we laughed it off, brushing aside the oddities. We joked about the place's strange history, imagining old stories of ghostly figures and mysterious happenings. We had heard the rumors about the Pinewood Hotel, of course, who hadn't? Locals whispered about strange noises, sightings of people who had checked in but never left, and the sense that the hotel had a way of making people feel uneasy. But these were just rumors, we told ourselves. We weren't the type to be easily spooked. Still, the place didn't feel quite right. We finally made our way to the room, and the moment the door creaked open, I felt a chill again. The room wasn't large, but it had a certain charm to it. The furniture was old, but in decent condition. The bed was neatly made, with the hotel's signature dark green and gold bedding that seemed a little too ornate for my taste, but comfortable enough. The small window looked out into the woods, the trees swaying lightly in the breeze, and the faint glow of the moon illuminating the scene just outside. Not bad, one of my friends said, dropping his suitcase onto the floor with a thud. Yeah, it's fine, I replied, though something still lingered in the back of my mind. Something I couldn't ignore. As we began to settle in, I couldn't help but notice the odd details, little things that didn't quite add up. The clock on the wall, for example, was running backward. It wasn't a huge issue, but it was the kind of thing that made me question whether I was just seeing things. Maybe it was the jet lag or the long drive, but everything in the room seemed slightly out of place. The air felt dense, heavy, and I wondered if it was just the old building. But the longer I stood in that room, the more I felt like it was pressing in on me. Like the walls were slowly moving closer. I tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion, and my friends seemed perfectly comfortable. They unpacked and joked as though nothing was out of the ordinary. But I couldn't help but feel watched. We decided to explore the hotel a bit, stretching our legs after the long drive. As we walked the halls, the atmosphere seemed even more oppressive. The lights flickered, casting odd shadows along the walls. In the dining room, an older couple sat quietly at a corner table, their eyes fixed on their plates, never speaking. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the back of the kitchen. It was then that I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around the room. No one was speaking. It wasn't a voice I recognized. And yet, it was as though someone had just breathed softly into my ear. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to have heard anything. I couldn't be sure if it was just my imagination running wild, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The eerie feeling didn't leave me, but we continued our exploration, trying to brush it off. After all, it was just an old hotel, right? Just an old, quiet place. But deep down, I knew that there was something strange about the Pinewood Hotel. Something far more sinister than just a few quirks of an old building. As we returned to our room later that evening, the air seemed even heavier. The shadows seemed darker. It was hard to put into words, but the hotel had a way of making you feel like you were never alone, even when no one was around. The sense of unease grew more pronounced as the hours ticked by, and the only thing that seemed to bring any comfort was the thought of sleep. But little did I know, this was only the beginning. The Pinewood Hotel had more to show us, things that no one could have predicted, and it would change everything. The night was thick with a restless quiet, the kind that seemed to fill the room with more weight than the air itself. It wasn't the typical kind of silence you'd expect from an old building, though. It was the kind that made you feel like something was missing, as if the room was listening. And for some reason, I couldn't stop feeling like we were being watched, like there were unseen eyes on us, tracing our every move. The lamps in the room cast dim yellow pools of light, and the shadows they formed were elongated, exaggerated, as though the darkness itself was trying to reach out and hold us there. We had spent the early evening exploring the hotel, but by the time we returned to our room, the sense of unease had only grown stronger. My friends were unfazed, chatting as they unpacked and fiddled with the television remote, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the silence or the strange sounds that seemed to echo from the walls every now and then, but I felt the growing pressure of something unseen. I tried to push those thoughts aside. After all, it was just an old building, nothing more. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to focus on the quiet hum of the air conditioning, a strange occurrence caught my attention. It started small, almost so subtle that I could have easily convinced myself it was a trick of my tired mind. The clock on the nightstand, an old-fashioned timepiece that had caught my eye when we first arrived, had stopped. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the battery had died, or it was just one of those old things that stopped working. But then I noticed something even stranger. The second hand, which had been ticking slowly, was now moving backward. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking it must have been my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But no, when I looked again, it was still happening. The hand on the clock was moving backward, tick by tick, slowly reversing its course. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the world around me had somehow shifted. I didn't know whether to laugh or feel disturbed. Maybe it was just a faulty clock, or maybe it was nothing more than my tired mind seeing things that weren't there. But in that moment, a small knot of dread formed in my stomach. I glanced around the room, looking for something familiar, something that could explain it. My friends were too busy with their own distractions to notice, but I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that crept up on me. I stood up and walked over to the clock, reaching out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a chill ran up my spine. The clock didn't feel cold, not in the way you'd expect from an old metal object. It was more than that. It was like it wasn't even alive. Like it didn't belong here. The seconds continued to tick backward as I stood there, paralyzed for a moment, my heart beating faster than it should. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the sensation that the hotel itself was trying to send me a message. But what was it? Why did I feel this way? What was going on? Everything okay? One of my friends called from across the room, snapping me out of my thoughts. Yeah, I'm fine, I replied, trying to sound casual, though I couldn't keep the tremor out of my voice. Just, the clock's acting weird. My friend chuckled, not taking it seriously. Old place, old things. Maybe the clock's just stuck. Yeah, maybe, I said, but I wasn't convinced. I forced a smile and sat back down on the bed, pretending it was nothing. But in the pit of my stomach, I could feel that something had shifted. For the rest of the evening, I tried to go about things as normal. We ate some food, laughed over jokes, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to relax again. But the clock still ticked backward, and every now and then, I would glance at it, feeling that strange pressure in my chest grow heavier. It wasn't until later that night, after we turned off the lights and climbed into bed, that I noticed something else. At first, it was a sound. A soft creaking coming from the corner of the room, near the window. I didn't think much of it at first. The house was old. Old houses creaked. But then it came again, louder this time. It was the unmistakable sound of floorboards groaning underfoot, as though someone was walking across the room. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen. But the sound stopped. Just as suddenly as it had started, it ceased, leaving only the heavy silence behind. I looked at my friends, their faces illuminated only by the dim glow of the moonlight creeping in through the curtains. They were still asleep, undisturbed, not hearing the sounds I just heard. For a moment, I questioned my own sanity. Was I just imagining things? Was the quiet making my mind play tricks? I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the sounds from the floor still fresh in my mind. It was hard to fall asleep after that. Every small noise, every creak of the building seemed to make my heart race a little faster. I pulled the blanket a little tighter around my shoulders, hoping that the sensation of safety would return, but it didn't. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in, and I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, watching the shadows in the corners of the room twist and stretch. The clock continued to tick backward, its hand moving with steady precision, and I couldn't escape the nagging thought that it wasn't just a malfunction, it was something else. Something intentional. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But even in my dreams, I couldn't escape the feeling that we weren't alone. There was something in the hotel, something in the room with us, something waiting. The next morning, when I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the clock. It had stopped moving completely. The second hand was frozen in place, just before it reached the 12. It wasn't moving forward or backward anymore. I got up, still feeling that sense of unease gnawing at me, and walked over to the clock again. I turned it over, looking for a battery compartment, but there was none. The clock was sealed shut, no obvious way to open it. It didn't make sense. "Hey, are you okay?" one of my friends asked, noticing my stare at the clock. "Yeah, just strange," I said, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. "The clock's broken, I guess." They didn't think much of it, brushing off the incident as another quirk of the hotel. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something had changed in the room. It was subtle at first, but I knew now that something was wrong. Something wasn't right with the Pinewood Hotel. I couldn't help but wonder, had I just imagined everything, or was the hotel itself somehow alive? The thought was absurd, but the growing sense of discomfort and the strange occurrences were undeniable. It wasn't long before I started noticing more signs, small ones, but undeniable. Every so often, I would hear a soft scratching noise at the door, like nails dragging across wood. But when I opened it, there was nothing there. The air in the room would suddenly grow colder, and the dim lights would flicker, casting odd shadows on the walls. The hotel was starting to feel more and more like a place that didn't want us there. Like something was trying to reach out, but we weren't meant to understand. The subtle hints were there, building in intensity, as if the hotel was only getting started. The days that followed felt like they were filled with an ever-increasing sense of dread, as though the hotel had its own pulse, and it was steadily growing stronger. At first, it had been the small, odd occurrences that seemed like nothing, just quirks of an old building. But now, things had started to happen more frequently, and with more intensity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting, making its presence known in the most subtle yet unmistakable ways. It wasn't just the strange sounds in the night anymore. It was everything. On the second night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find the room colder than it should have been. The heat had been working fine earlier, but now it was freezing, the kind of cold that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. The chill seemed to seep into my bones, even under the thick covers. I glanced over at my friends, still sound asleep, unaware of the growing tension in the air. I reached over to the nightstand, feeling for the thermostat. I pressed the buttons, trying to adjust the temperature, but it wasn't responding. The screen remained blank, as if it had stopped working entirely. I tried again, but the same thing happened. The cold pressed in around me, settling deeper in my chest. When I turned my head to look toward the corner of the room, I froze. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But no, something was there, standing by the window. A dark shape, almost like a figure, silhouetted against the faint light from the street lamp outside. I held my breath, waiting for it to move, but it stayed perfectly still. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that it wasn't just my imagination. There was something or someone there. I reached over to shake my friend awake, but just as my hand hovered over her arm, the figure vanished, disappearing into the darkness like it had never been there. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I tried to stay calm. I looked around the room, scanning every corner for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the eerie silence and the cold that lingered. I couldn't get back to sleep after that. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I wanted to wake my friends and tell them, but I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't even know if they would believe me. They would probably think it was a dream or some trick of the light. But I knew what I had seen. Something was in that room with us. By morning, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself that I had imagined it, but it was hard to ignore the way the room felt. The cold hadn't dissipated, even though the air conditioning had finally started working again. The oppressive stillness remained, thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest like an invisible weight. At breakfast, I tried to bring it up casually. "Has anyone noticed anything strange about the room?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. My friends glanced at each other before one of them shrugged. "You mean the weird clock?" she asked, a small laugh in her voice. "Yeah, that thing's freaky." I hesitated. That wasn't exactly what I had meant, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. "Yeah, I guess," I replied. "But last night, I saw something. By the window. I swear it was like a figure standing there." There was a brief silence before they all exchanged glances again. "Are you sure it wasn't just a shadow?" one of them asked. "I mean, this place is pretty old. Shadows can do weird things, especially at night." I wanted to agree with them, to brush it off as nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a shadow. It was something else. I just couldn't explain it. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the feeling of unease only grew. We spent some time walking around the hotel, exploring as many hallways and rooms, trying to take in the history and charm of the place. The hotel itself was beautiful, grand, even, but there was something unsettling about it. The walls felt too thick, the hallways too long. And the further we went, the more isolated it seemed. The air grew mustier the deeper we wandered into the building, and I started to notice things, small things, but things that made my skin crawl. One hallway had an old, faded portrait on the wall, a picture of a woman, her eyes eerily intense. I couldn't help but stare at it for a moment longer than necessary, feeling an odd pull toward her gaze. The closer I got, the more her expression seemed to change, as though she were watching me. I quickly turned away, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that settled in my chest. Later that day, while walking down another corridor, one of my friends stopped and pointed to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and a faint, low hum was coming from inside. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, a note of curiosity in her voice. We all stopped, straining to listen. The sound was so faint, almost imperceptible. But there was no mistaking it. It was a hum, like the faint ringing of a bell, but it didn't have a clear source. The longer I listened, the more unsettling it became, like it was coming from all around us, but not from anywhere specific. "That's weird," another friend said, her voice low. "Maybe we should check it out." I didn't want to. My instincts were telling me to turn around and leave, but something inside of me wanted to know what was causing that noise. Maybe it was the need to explain the unexplainable, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, we walked down the hallway toward the door. The closer we got, the stronger the hum became, until it was almost vibrating through the floor. We reached the door, and I hesitated. It was strange that it was open at all. Hotels didn't leave rooms unlocked like this. I pushed the door open slowly, and the sound seemed to intensify. The room was dark, but there was an odd, flickering light coming from somewhere. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I could make out a figure standing in the center of the room. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaky. The figure, no. The shadow had shifted, its form now standing unnaturally still. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. We all stood frozen, staring into the darkened room, the hum now replaced with an eerie silence. The air grew thicker, and the temperature dropped even more, if that was possible. It felt like we were being suffocated, trapped in that room with whatever this thing was. "I don't like this," my friend muttered. "Let's get out of here." But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my feet unable to move, as though my body was paralyzed. The figure slowly turned toward us, and I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, seeping into my very soul. I blinked, and it was gone. The room was empty, the hum gone, the flickering light vanished. I didn't know how to react. My breath was shallow, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. It was as if the whole world had stopped spinning for a moment, and we were left standing on the edge of something we couldn't understand. "We need to leave," I said, my voice tight. "Now." We turned and walked away as fast as we could, but the strange feeling of being watched lingered, following us every step of the way. I could still hear that low hum echoing in my mind, feel the coldness pressing against me, even as we exited the hallway. I didn't speak of it again, not to my friends. They'd seen it too, but none of us could explain it. The hotel was changing, and with each passing moment, it felt more like it was alive, like it was aware of us. The following day passed in a tense, heavy silence. We spoke little, each of us haunted by the strange events that had unfolded the night before. The entire hotel felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in, pressing in on us from all sides. It was as if the building itself had turned against us, and we were no longer welcome. We had tried to leave the hotel earlier that day, but when we went to check out, the front desk told us something unexpected. Our reservation had been extended. Apparently, the system had been updated, and we were booked for another night. No one could explain how or why. My first instinct was to argue and demand that we leave immediately, but the staff were oddly insistent, almost too calm. They reassured us that it would be fine. "Just one more night," they said, almost like it was a suggestion that we wouldn't be allowed to refuse. Something in their tone made me uncomfortable. But what choice did we have? We were trapped. We spent the rest of the afternoon trying to distract ourselves, but everything around us seemed to be growing more unsettling. Even the light from the windows seemed wrong, too dim, too distant. As night approached, I could feel the weight of something looming over us, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. That night, we decided to stay in the room and lock ourselves in. We would make it through the night, and then we would leave at first light. No matter what. As the night fell, we huddled together in the dimly lit room, too frightened to go back into the hallway. The cold that had plagued us for days had returned, more intense than before. The temperature dropped again, and no amount of adjusting the thermostat could change it. We could see our breath in the air as we spoke, the mist rising from our lips, making the room feel like it had been frozen in time. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before, each second dragging on with an unnatural weight. It seemed to echo, filling the silence with its hollow sound. The pressure in the room grew, and with it, a sense of dread. The walls felt like they were closing in around us, and the quiet was too perfect, too suffocating. And then, without warning, it happened. At first, it was a faint sound, so quiet we could almost convince ourselves it was nothing. But then it grew louder, closer. A voice. Soft at first, like the faintest murmur, but then clearer, sharper, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. It was a low, guttural whisper, and though the words were indistinguishable, the tone was unmistakable, cold, threatening, and filled with malice. We all froze. It wasn't just the voice. The air in the room seemed to pulse, thickening with an unseen force. My heart raced in my chest, and I could feel my palms begin to sweat. The room seemed to darken, the corners turning blacker and more oppressive by the second. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something unseen, something that was moving in the shadows. Then there was a sound that sent a shock of terror through my body, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath us. It was as though the very foundation of the hotel was alive. The growl turned into a wail, long and haunting, the kind that sends chills down your spine and makes your blood run cold. I couldn't breathe. We scrambled to our feet, looking around the room for the source of the noise, but there was nothing, just the empty space, the dim light, and the unsettling stillness that surrounded us. Yet, the presence in the room had become undeniable. It was as if the very air had been sucked out, replaced by something else. Something malevolent. The door slammed shut, locking us in, the sound of the impact echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. The temperature plummeted further, the cold seeping into our skin, and I could see my friends' faces twisted in fear. Their eyes were wide, pupils dilated, their breath coming out in shallow gasps. "We need to leave," one of my friends whispered, but her voice was shaking, barely audible. I looked toward the door, but the keycard wouldn't work. It kept flashing red, refusing to unlock. We were trapped, and the more we struggled, the more desperate we became. The growl turned into a raspy laugh, low and sickening. It echoed around us, bouncing off the walls, reverberating in my skull. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones. The lights flickered once, then went out completely, leaving us in total darkness. My pulse hammered in my chest. I could hear my friend's frantic breathing, but the room seemed to be closing in even more. The air was thick, like I was choking, and every breath I took felt like it was being drawn through a filter of ice. Then, in the pitch black, I heard something, or rather, someone moving in the dark. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor, and then a voice that I recognized but couldn't place. "Help me." The words were soft, broken, as though the speaker was in pain. I felt a chill run through me, like fingers brushing against my spine, sending shivers down my whole body. I turned, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was nothing in the darkness, no one to be seen. "Who's there?" I gasped, my voice trembling. There was a long pause before the voice came again, closer this time. "Help me." It was unmistakable now, a desperate plea, filled with anguish. And then, in the darkness, something moved. A figure, pale and distorted, emerged from the shadows. I screamed. It was her, the woman from the portrait, the one I had seen earlier in the hallway. Her face was twisted, disfigured, and she moved toward us with unnatural speed, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, unable to escape. She was there, right in front of me. Her cold, clammy hand reached out, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. Her skin was as cold as ice, and I could feel the life being drained from my body as her touch seeped into me. I tried to pull away, but she held me tight, her fingers digging into my skin. Her mouth opened, and I could hear the whisper again. Only now it was clearer. It was the same voice, the same tortured plea. "Help me." I felt my breath catch in my throat as I looked into her eyes, empty, hollow, filled with centuries of pain. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This place was alive. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was feeding on us. It had drawn us here, trapped us in its grasp, and now it was going to claim us as its own. The lights flickered once more, and in the brief flash of light, I saw the full extent of the horror. The walls were moving, not in the way walls should move, but in a way that was far more unsettling. The wallpaper seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing, and behind it, I saw shadows, not the normal kind, but shadows that reached out and twisted like tendrils of smoke, stretching toward us, trying to pull us in. I screamed again, and this time, my voice echoed through the room, louder than the growl, louder than the wail. But it didn't matter. The shadows were closing in, suffocating the air, and the woman's grip on me tightened. I knew there was no escape. The room seemed to close in around us, the temperature plummeting even further. Every breath I took felt like ice in my lungs, and I could barely move. The woman, no. The thing still held me in its cold, vice-like grip. Her touch was freezing, sending waves of paralyzing terror through me. I could hear my friends screaming, but the sounds were distant, muffled by the overwhelming presence of the figure in front of me. The shadows in the room had thickened, stretching toward us like dark, insidious fingers. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to escape, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own fear. Then, just as I thought I would lose my mind from the sheer weight of the terror surrounding us, a flash of light, bright, blinding, cut through the darkness. The woman, if that's even what she was, shrieked, a high-pitched wail that reverberated through the walls, rattling my teeth. The shadows recoiled, retreating back into the corners of the room, and the grip on my wrist loosened just enough for me to yank my arm free. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. My friends were still there, huddled together in the far corner of the room, their faces pale and wide-eyed with fear. I could see that they, too, were struggling to make sense of what was happening. We were all in this nightmare together, but none of us knew how to get out. The blinding light flickered again, and this time I saw it, the figure that had saved us. It wasn't a person, but a shape, a form, a translucent glow that seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost peaceful. It hovered in the center of the room, its presence enough to push back the oppressive darkness. For a moment, everything was still. The air felt lighter, as though the weight of the hotel's malevolent force had been temporarily lifted. The figure spoke, its voice was calm, soothing, and echoed through the room like a gentle breeze. Leave. Now. The command was clear, not a suggestion, but a force of will. We didn't need any more convincing. I looked at my friends, and without another word, we rushed to the door. Somehow, it had unlocked itself. The keycard, which had refused to work earlier, now glowed green, as if the hotel itself was granting us permission to leave. We ran out of the room, down the hallway, and straight to the elevator. The strange energy that had been choking us in that room seemed to follow us, though not as intensely as before. It was still there, lingering just behind us, like a shadow that wouldn't quite let go. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and we hurried inside. The ride down felt endless. My heart pounded in my chest as we descended, the silence in the elevator almost suffocating. Every second that passed felt like a threat, like we weren't quite safe yet. The elevator finally reached the ground floor, and the doors opened. We spilled out into the lobby, and the air felt different here, cleaner, lighter. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us for days was gone, replaced by the stale, lifeless air of the hotel. The front desk clerk, who had seemed so friendly just a day ago, was still standing there, as though nothing had happened. She smiled at us, a cold, mechanical smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We hope you enjoyed your stay," she said in a monotone voice. None of us replied. We didn't stop to talk to her, didn't even acknowledge her existence. We simply left the building, stepping out into the night air. The cool breeze felt like a relief, washing over me like a balm. But as I looked back at the hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. Something from inside, hidden in the shadows of the building. The hotel stood silent, looming in the distance like a dark monolith, its windows reflecting the dim light of the street lamps. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in one of those windows, something shifting, something watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. We didn't speak much on the way back to the car. The silence was heavy, each of us processing what had happened in our own way. None of us dared to look back, and none of us spoke of the events that had just transpired. It was as if acknowledging the nightmare would somehow make it real again. We made it to the car, piled in, and drove away. We didn't look back at the hotel. It felt like if we did, we would be pulled back into that place, back into the dark, suffocating grip of whatever had taken hold of us. It wasn't until we were miles away from the hotel that I allowed myself to breathe again. I glanced at my friends, each of them pale and shaken, but still alive. We had made it out, but something inside me nagged at me. Something wasn't right. The days that followed were filled with questions. We tried to make sense of what had happened, but the more we talked about it, the more the details began to slip away, like water through our fingers. It was as if the hotel itself didn't want us to remember. The further we got from that place, the fuzzier everything became. We returned home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. I would hear noises in the night, footsteps, whispers in the dark. At times, I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that I was still there, trapped in that hotel room. But the strangest part? There were no records of the hotel we stayed at. No online reviews, no address, no name. It was as if the place had never existed. I tried searching, trying to find anything that could explain it, but I came up empty every time. I still think about the woman, the thing that had grabbed me. Was it a spirit? A ghost? Or was it something else entirely? I don't know, and I don't think I want to know. One thing's for sure, the hotel is still out there, waiting. The thing is, I don't think it wants to let go of us. I know, deep down, that we were only a small part of its story, and there are others who will be drawn there too. Others who will find themselves trapped in that same nightmare. Maybe that's the real horror, that the hotel will never truly let go. And neither will we. As the weeks went by after we left the hotel, life began to slowly return to normal, or at least what I thought was normal. I tried to bury the memories of what happened, convincing myself that it was just a bad experience, a one-off, something that could be explained away by my mind playing tricks on me. After all, we were all under stress, and it had been a long trip. There had to be a reasonable explanation for everything, right? But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we hadn't fully escaped whatever it was that haunted that place. The nightmares began. At first, they were just fleeting images, flickers of shadows in the corner of my room, a face that appeared in the window as I tried to fall asleep, the distant sound of footsteps in the hall. But then, the dreams grew more vivid. I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, knowing that something had been in the room with me, something that had been watching. I would look around, half expecting to see the dark figure from the hotel standing in the corner, waiting to pull me back into that nightmare. I tried talking to my friends about it, but they were no better off. They too had been plagued by strange dreams and lingering feelings of dread. We had all tried to move on, but something had followed us, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Every time we tried to get past it, something new would happen, a strange noise at night, a flicker of movement out of the corner of our eyes, a sense of being watched. The presence from the hotel had somehow latched itself onto us, and no matter how hard we tried, it refused to let go. It was around this time that I began to look for answers. I didn't know what else to do. What had really happened at that hotel? Was it just an isolated incident, or was something more sinister at play? I found myself combing through forums, talking to people who had stayed at the same hotel. And that's when I found it the same name, repeated in multiple posts. The hotel that had no name. The hotel that didn't exist on any map, but which seemed to keep drawing people in, people who would stay there for a night, and sometimes never leave. I started talking to more people, trying to connect the dots. There were whispers, faint mentions of things that couldn't be explained. Stories of people who had checked in, but had never checked out. Of rooms that were locked and never opened again. Of guests who reported hearing voices, seeing figures in the halls, and feeling as though they were being watched by something that wasn't quite human. It became clear to me that the hotel was no ordinary building. It was a place that drew people in, a place that fed off fear, a place where things were not quite right, and no one ever seemed to leave unscathed. As I delved deeper into the research, I learned more about the history of the area where the hotel was built. The land itself was steeped in mystery. There had been reports of strange happenings dating back to the early 1900s, before the hotel was even constructed. Local legends spoke of disappearances, of strange lights in the sky, of whispers in the wind. People who had lived near the area claimed that there was something wrong with the land itself, that it was cursed. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that the hotel was only the most recent chapter in a much older story. It was becoming increasingly clear to me that there was no easy way out. The hotel was not just a place, it was a force, an entity that was tied to the land, to the very fabric of reality itself. And once you crossed its threshold, you were never really free. I reached out to some of the people who had stayed at the hotel, hoping to find some closure. Some of them had left the area, some had returned, but the common thread was always the same. They all felt a lingering sense of unease, a nagging feeling that something was following them, watching them, even after they left. It wasn't just the strange events they had witnessed, it was the feeling that the hotel had marked them, that they were now connected to it in some way, whether they liked it or not. It was as though the hotel had a claim on them, and it would never let them go. The more I heard from others, the more I realized how deeply the hotel's influence could reach, how far its tendrils could stretch. The weight of it all started to take a toll on me. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had tried to distance myself from the hotel, to forget about it, but no matter how hard I tried, it kept pulling me back. The memories, the dreams, the overwhelming sense of dread, it all became too much. It was as though the hotel had marked me as its next victim, as if it was just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to take its toll. And yet, as much as I tried to distance myself from the hotel, I knew something deep inside of me, something I couldn't explain, told me that the hotel was still watching. Even now, as I sit here reflecting on everything that happened, I can feel its presence in the back of my mind, a constant, gnawing reminder that I am never truly free. The more I think about it, the more I realize that I'll never escape it, that none of us will. So, what's the point of all this? What can you take away from this story? Well, maybe the real horror isn't just the ghosts, the shadows, or the figures that lurk in the corners of our minds. Maybe the real horror is the feeling of being trapped, of knowing that you can never truly leave, no matter how far you run. The hotel isn't just a place. It's a symbol of something far more terrifying, something that attaches itself to you, something that follows you, even long after you think you've escaped.